All right, Julia, you can start whenever you're ready.
Okay. So thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to have this opportunity to present some ideas on media pluralism and what can be done to solve today's media crisis. The presentation would be mainly based on my book, Information is a Public Good, that is joint work with Benoît Huet, as well as on a research article, Hosting Media Bias, where we study the determinants of media bias on French broadcast and discuss different measures of bias. I guess in this summit, we all agree on the fact that the media market is completely upheaval. This is the case in a lot of different Western democracies. This is the case, for example, in France, when there are a number of threats, both on pluralism, in particular with the French issue, but European issue too, of Vincent Bolloré, and today the open inquiry of the European Commissions about Vivendi and Lagardère. There are also some issues about freedom of speech. If you look everywhere, and this is a threat on media pluralism, one of the things that we see is a rising concentration of the media industry. And this happens both because we have a decreasing number of media outlets. So you have a media outlet that just disappears. And for those that are still here, what we saw, for example, in the US with the Sinclair Group in recent years is the fact that you had previously independent local newspapers or local TV channels that are now purchased by a number of conglomerates. This raises a number of issues to which I need to add the fact that when we think in terms of media pluralism and media concentration, it's not enough to think in terms of market share. So look at concentration on the newspaper market, for example, or the market share of the different TV stations on the television market. It's important to take into account what Andrea Pratt, who is an Italian economist at Columbia University, has called the attention shares, because it's not at all the same thing to have two TV channels if you have one whose viewers only watch this TV channel and another one whose viewers watch the TV channel and also consume some newspapers and also listen to some radio. In one case, in a sense, the TV channel is going to capture 100% of the attention shares of the viewers, and then you have really an issue of the plurality of the opinions that viewers can benefit from. And on the other, in the other case, at the end of the day, viewers are going to be exposed to a number of different points of view. The other thing I want to highlight is the fact that I guess in terms of policies, it's always important to distinguish what we can call external pluralism and internal pluralism. So external pluralism will be really for example, for TV, about ownership diffusion. So you make sure that there is not too much market concentration. And again, I think we shouldn't think only in terms of market shares, but also in terms of attention share when we talk about market concentration. And we should also care about internal pluralism, given the fact that even today, this might sound surprising, in particular because many of us, I guess, are used to watch and consume multiple media outlets, including social media, and consume news from a variety of sources. If you look at the large share of the population, these are the population that is on average a little bit older, but these are also those people that tend to vote more. One of the things that we see is that they can consume only one TV channel, for example. And so if you do not make sure that there is different point of view exposed on this TV channel, at the end of the day, we will also suffer from this lack of pluralism. And this is why, historically in the US, you had things such as the FCC fairness doctrine, and you have regulatory agencies such as Ofcom in the UK or Arcom in France. Media pluralism, this is a huge topic. So I'm trying to focus my presentation today on one aspect, and the idea is to see whether we can reinforce journalist agency as a potential source of pluralism, even in a context where there is increasing market concentration. One of the things that I want to highlight before turning to two big stuff I want to discuss with you is that I'm well aware of the fact that you have various forms of media ownership, and media ownership is not only like commercial ownership, and this is good news in a sense, because I really do believe that information is a public good, but it's not because you have a foundation or a non-profit organizations owning a media outlet that you solve the issue of media pluralism and that you solve the issue of media independence. Philanthropy can be a good thing. Philanthropy is not the solution per se, because what I think is really key, and this is where I'm going to focus my presentation today, what I think is really key is the issue of the governance of the media organization. And you can have like a good governance for a commercial media and a bad governance for a non-profit media organization. So I'm going to like discuss two things that I wanted to put into debate, and get your feedback on that. One is what we call with Benoît Huet in our book, an information democratization law, to reinforce the independence of journalists and, in a sense, to give journalists more agency. And the other one is media vouchers to fund the provision of high quality information. So what is the information democratization law? In a sense, I want to have this the following departure point. In an ideal world, we will have a much more democratic way of owning different media outlets, and we will have the main and majority of the media outlets that are not owned by a couple or like several, like 10 or 15, it depends on the country, billionaires, but you will have ownership by readers, and you will have ownership by journalists, and you will have some like democratic ownerships of the media organization. In today's world is not what we have. We can change the rules a little bit, and we can like change the rules that regulate concentration, but we also know that for some media outlets, if I take the big TV groups in a country like France, it will be the same thing in the UK or in Germany, their value at the end of the day would be somewhere between like 3, 4, 5 billion euros. So for this amount of money, it's very hard to have a democratization of who owns the capital. And basically the idea I want to defend here is that even if we cannot democratize who owns the capital, one of the things that is of importance is to democratize who owns the voting right. And that, in a sense, and I really think this is the way to go. And this should be like discussed, I guess. There is already a number of things in the European Media Freedom Act, MFRR regulation, that is discussed today. I think we should push it further, in particular in terms of democratizing the governance of the media. And so there are a number of principles that I think would be important and would lead to a huge improvement of today's situation in terms of both pluralism and independence of journalists. The first one is what I call the shared governance of the media. I think we should set up some rules that oblige the media outlets to have boards that include representative of the editorial staff. And so, for example, you could have like 50-50, between those who own the capital and representative of the journalists. And this would be like a first and very interesting way to better guarantee journalist independence. The second thing is that I think that the appointment of the managing director by the board should get the assent of at least 60% of the journalists. This already exists for a number of different media outlets, and this is also a very good way, to protect media independence and to protect journalist independence, because then it means, that those that can take the decisions, and in particular in terms of editorial lines, the managing director, they do not have their legitimacy only from the shareholders themselves, but also from the other journalists. The third point, and I think this is a key point, is the approval agreement. So what is the approval agreement? The idea is to give a right to the journalist to vote on the new shareholder when there is a change in ownership. So basically, tomorrow you have a media outlets that is going to change hand. So you have a new shareholders, majority shareholders entering the media outlets. You cannot buy it like that. You need to get the assentment of at least half of the journalists. This can sound crazy to you. I have to say that in France, if you take the main national French daily newspaper, It is the commercial newspapers with a huge audience, large number of journalists. It's not a communist newspaper. You know, if you take Le Monde as of today, Le Monde newspaper, they have this as part of their bylaws. So as of today in France, Le Monde cannot be bought by a new shareholder if these shareholders do not obtain the assent of half of the journalist. And I also think that this is the key thing, you know, if you really want to protect journalist independence, because, you know, from time to time you say, but we have no choice, and there is this billionaire or this other guy that is like happy to save these media outlets. At the end of the day, this is a way, you know, for the journalist to obtain guarantee at the time of the change in ownership. I also think that we should do much better in terms of transparency of media ownership. A point that is of importance is that, in particular in the internet era, that the journalists should employ at least, the media should employ at least a minimum proportion of journalists. And I think they should reinvest, because media are producing public good. They should reinvest at least part of their annual profits. Now I'm showing you these rules, and you might agree with them, but you might also wonder, how do we impose them? By law. You know, like you are a new media outlet, you create like media organizations. There is no reason why, a priori, you know, the law can make these different points compulsory. In fact, you have two different tools that you can use as a government. The first one, for those media outlets in countries where there is press subsidies, for example, reduced VAT. You know, reduced VAT is not for like all the different organizations that say we are a media. You need to go through a certain number of criteria to say, okay, this organization is a media outlet producing information as a public good, so that it can benefit from reduced VAT. And other press subsidies, either direct subsidies or indirect subsidies, is really vary from one country to the other. So one of the things that is key, I think, is to say, okay, now if you want to qualify to benefit from these press subsidies, these are a number of additional criteria you need to respect. And if you don't want to go through these criteria, so for example, to give more political power to your journalists, then we are not going to consider that you produce information as a public good. And so you won't benefit from the press subsidies. The other tools that are within the hand of, it depends of the country, so it can be either the government or different regulatory agency, is in a number of countries, you need to apply to get access to TV stations or to radio channels. Okay, and you need to go through a certain number of criteria. You can also add this criteria about shared governance, right of approval, transparency of media ownership as criteria that are made compulsory in a sense if you want to be considered as TV stations or radio channels. Okay. The last thing I want to discuss, so this is really about governance. And the second thing I want to discuss, given that we are talking about media pluralism, and I really think that one of the threats to media pluralism today is that we do not have enough media outlets, in particular because due to the economic crisis, you know, we can move back to the introduction of the internet in the 2000, the 2007-8 economic crisis, then it was a little bit better. And then after we had COVID, now there is a war in Ukraine, the rise in the cost of the papers, the decline in the advertising market. We know that like commercial media outlets are suffering a lot. Given that they're producing a public good, it's good to have some public money to fund these media outlets. And so the question is, what would be the optimal form to have more public funding for the different media? And here I'm going to defend a proposal that we first pushed with Joshua Ganch, Brian Knight, Andrea Pratt, and others in 2019 as part of a report that was called Protecting Journalism in the Age of Digital Platform, and that we also discussed with Benoit. So, okay, saying that we need public money to support journalism, it's really not new. And as I was highlighted before, you know, in a lot of different countries, we already have subsidies, public money for journalism, either direct or indirect public subsidies. I was referring to VAT before, but I could mention like tax credit, postal subsidies, and you also have some funding of public broadcasters. Public subsidies, some people, they completely oppose them, and they have a number of valid points. First, they say that it can be used as a threat to editorial independence, which may be the case in a number of countries if the rules are not well defined. And if you look at the relationship, between the government and the media in countries such as Poland or Hungary, not only with public subsidies, it can also be with like public advertisement into the media. You don't want to give like more weight in a sense to the government or more tools to be able to influence the media. So we were trying to think about a way to have like more public funding for the media outlets, but without any government interference. Okay, so a way to have like public money with no government intervention. And this is where we went with this media voucher system. So the idea is to have a voucher system funding by public money, but then the money is not allocated by the government to some media that is going to pick. The money is allocated by the citizens themselves to the media outlets of their choice. So let me be more clear. So basically, the idea would be to give each adult media vouchers worth like a certain number of euros. In my favorite proposal, it would be like 50 euros for countries like France or UK or Germany. And these media vouchers, then each adult can allocate it to his favored media outlets. In a sense, this is in the spirit of the democracy vouchers that are being defended by Laurence for years in the US and that were put in place in recent years in the city of Seattle. Concretely, even if it could obviously take different forms, but I think this will work well. We were looking for a system where every citizen will use its media voucher. Because we know when each time you introduce like new scheme to have more participatory democracy, very often it is made inefficient by the fact that you will have half or like 2/3 of the people that are not going to use this tool, in particular because they might not be aware. At least there is something everyone has to do on an annual basis, which is to fill the tax return. So the idea is when you fill the tax return, you can indicate to the tax administration the media outlets to which you want to allocate your media vouchers. And obviously, this would be done through with preserved anonymity, which can be like ensured by any like protocols of anonymous voting that can be based on the blockchain or other or this kind of systems. I have to say that this kind of ideas, these media vouchers, they're also inspired by stuff that exists as of today in different countries. So for example, in Italy, when you fill your tax returns as of today, you can put the codice, so the code, the number of the political party to which you want to allocate the equivalent in Italy of 2% of your tax revenues. And this is done through the tax form. This is done with preserved anonymity, and this works pretty well as a way to allocate this public money, even if there are reasons why I'm not very happy with this system. But basically, why do we want to go this way? I think because we want to have more public funding for the media outlet with no government intervention. For this reason, you want the largest possible number of media outlets to be able to benefit from this system. So you really want to introduce only a very small number of rules, among which, of course, I will defend those that I argue for, like at the beginning of this talk, and in particular, the fact of having like a democratic governance, transparency of ownership, approval right, and to have at least some journalists, which matter for media outlets. One question you might wonder is how do we ensure pluralism with this mechanism? And this is a fair question, and I'm talking about media pluralism, so I'm supposed to present you like solution. Like the way we do that is by introducing a threshold. So the idea is that, for example, in the US, you don't want everyone to contribute to Fox News, or in the UK, everyone to contribute to the Guardian or to the BBC because they are the most famous media outlets. So how do you guarantee pluralism and avoid concentration? The idea we have is the fact that we should introduce a threshold. So we have to make sure that no media outlets can receive more, let's say that 1%, or it can be 0.5, but let's say 1% of the total number of media vouchers. What do happen when people do not allocate the vouchers, or where we have above this 0.5 or 1% threshold? I think in this case, the solution will be to allocate the voucher depending on other citizens' allocation. So, for example, if you decide not to use your media voucher, it's a little bit when you decide, not to go and vote. If you decide not to go and vote, you are going to live with a government that is elected by those people who turn out. It will be a little bit the same idea here with this media voucher. I will be out of time in 30 seconds. So let me just tell you why I think this is better than existing proposal. I think this is much better than the tax deductions associated to philanthropy or to media philanthropy for sure, because this tax deduction, and this has been well documented in the literature, in general, they only benefit the rich. So those people that have enough money to give, and the more money they have to give, the more they're going to benefit from the tax deductions. At least with the vouchers, you give the same amount to all the citizens independently of the revenues. So in a sense, this is a more equal and democratic system compared to existing scheme of public funding. This is much better because we are sure to preserve media independence, given that there will be no government intervention. I also think, even if you can discuss that this is better than free subscription to a media outlet, in particular, because you might also want to help those media outlets that are too small to be behind the paywall. And if you do that through a free subscription, you are only going to have a system that will benefit those media outlets that are behind the paywall. So yeah, these are some ideas. They are not perfect, but at least I hope you found them of interest. And I thank you very much for your time and attention.
Non, j'entends pas.
Can you hear me now? All right. I was saying, hi everyone. Welcome to the MFRR Summit. My name is Camille Petit. I'm working for the European Federation of Journalists. And to start this third day, you understood that we'll be discussing media capture in France. I was also thanking Julia Cagé for her compelling speech, which included many ideas, many very concrete solutions to solve the media crisis in France. And we're going to discuss this further. I have the pleasure to welcome two researchers, Laurence Larochelle, postdoctoral scholar, currently at the Université of Québec in Montreal, and also at the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris. Welcome, Laurence. And today we also welcome Alan Oukrat, Associate Professor in Communication and Media Studies at the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris. The reason why we invited you today is because you are the researchers for the Media Pluralism Monitor 2023, which has not yet been published, but this is a monitor which assesses the risk to media pluralism in 32 European countries, and you are researching the situation in France. So thank you very much for joining us today. To begin with, I'd like to ask you for a reaction actually to Julia Cagé's speech. As she said, she wants our feedback actually. So we heard concrete proposals, even a bill to make the functioning of democratic, the functioning of media outlets more democratic, and even media vouchers to support the funding of private media outlets. Actually, do they sound crazy to you? Maybe Alan, you can start with a reaction. To what extent do you think these proposals can push back the political and economic pressure that exists today in the media in France?
Well, thank you for the invitation and to talk in reaction to Julia Caget's talk. What is good and really interesting in Julia Caget's work is that she concretely proposes things, operational things, and connect media economies with the qualities of news produced and spread or broadcast. It is really interesting, because it's concrete and operational. But also, I think we should not distinguish economical solution as mere technical solution without embedding social and political issue at stake, like trust in news by citizen and consumer. The trust of people in news is not solely related to the problem of who is the owner of the media or the governance of the media. It is also related to the trust citizens put in journalistic work. To democratize the governance of mainstream general and political media by including the voice of the journalist will not necessarily connect citizens to news producers and help people to feel closer to media. If the solution seems appealing, it appeals probably more to privileged and educated ones than to the entire population. It is on news organization to convince people of their social utility and capacity to investigate and reveals how institutional, economic, and political power works in the service of the population, and not to give the idea that they are complacent with the state of the affair and in the service of the powerful elites. Citizens must be more involved in the regulation of private and public media and have a seat in the administrative authority in charge of their regulation, like ARCOM in France. The problem might be first and foremost a political one rather than an economical one. Both are related, but it is doubtful that one can fix the other. I will maybe stop here if you like, or I can continue. I have other points.
Thank you, Alan. I think, yeah, to really understand, I think what's at stake, it's really the trust in media and in the work of journalists. That's also something that Julia Caget just said. I just wanted to give you a few figures, as I find two recent polls, one from 2022 and one actually which was published this week from 2023, which show that a majority of citizens, 62% for 2022, think that journalists are not independent from political and economic interests. And this week's barometer shows that the French have little or no trust at all in journalists' work in two specific fields, one in politics, so journalists working in politics, so 53%, and in economics, so 42%. So these are the two topics that generate the least trust in comparison to other topics, and in particular, sport, culture, and health, even health. That's interesting. So I think this is really important to really understand that what's affected at the end of the day is really the trust in the media and in the work of the journalists. Maybe now I'd like to turn to Laurence. If you have a reaction also to Julia Caget's proposal, but I also wanted to know then about the situation in France, and if you could tell us a little bit how concentrated and captured actually the French media market is.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to point out that France's constitution and legal apparatus ensure freedom of the press, of opinion, and of expression. However, it's true that there are several issues requiring specific scrutiny, and I would like to point out two major issues requiring particular attention that we identified during our survey on media pluralism in France. So one of the most obvious problems pertaining to freedom of information relates to the July 2018 law on the protection of trade secrets, which is in line with the June 2016 EU directive. So this law considers that information which has a commercial value and is deemed secret by companies should be protected, and thus that any person obtaining, using, or publishing it can be prosecuted. So this law was criticized by journalists and civil society associations, obviously for the limitations it imposes to media freedom. And there have been several recent cases in which this apparatus was used to restrict access to information deemed of public interest. More precisely, in 2022, companies initiated a flurry of slaps against several independent media outlets in France. For instance, the group Altis sued the media outlet Reflet for breach of trade secrets. So Reflet stood by its reporting, stressing that the information published was of public interest, did not contain any trade secret, and that the personal revelations about Patrick Drahi, the owner of Altis Group, were conducted properly. Despite the reactions of French journalists' unions, the Commercial Court of Nanterre ordered the independent investigative media Reflet not to publish any new information about Altis. So the censorship of articles which were not even published is based on the 2018 law on protecting trade secrets. As far as the public service media independence is concerned, the abolition of the audiovisual tax adopted on July 23rd, 2022, raises the question of financing. So submitting the PSM to state budget could force these media to negotiate their budget each year with the government and the parliament. Consequently, the abolition of the audiovisual tax may be dangerous for the independence of information provided by PSM, and thus become opposite to several national and or even European texts. So it is worth mentioning that the abolition of the audiovisual tax was promised by Emmanuel Macron during his presidential campaign as a solution to the decline of in purchasing power in France. However, it is worth mentioning that the majority of citizens disagreed with the abolition of the audiovisual tax. In fact, the independent financing of public service media leaves no room for political and or commercial pressure, so allowing thus the journalists to fulfill their watchdog role. But submitting public service media to the state budget may result to journalists become more vulnerable to political pressure. And in addition, it does not guarantee the financial stability of these media, which can reduce the means available to journalists for conducting their investigations. So I would say that the media concentration in France is, as it has already been pointed out, a major issue, but I would also add that the abolition of the audiovisual tax and the July 2018 law are also two crucial elements that should be taken into consideration, as they may be important dangers for the independency of media and journalists in France and the freedom of information.
Thank you, Laurence. There is also, so within the media pluralism, there are many indicators, and one of them is the social inclusiveness, because when we talk about media pluralism, so we talk about what we discussed so far, the market, the ownership, the number of media outlets in each sector, but we also talk about the diversity in media content, diversity in newsrooms, diversities of media outlets, but also of journalistic sources. And this also can have an impact on the coverage of certain topics and on the level of trust from the public. How does the French media scape stand on this issue of diversity and social inclusiveness?
I would like to say that gender equality in the media is an indicator that scores high risk in this year's report. It is worth mentioning that gender equality is part of the PSM performance contracts and is supported by the September 1986 law and its amendments. They all have aimed at favoring equality and the representation of diversity in various fields. However, The representation of women within French media seems to not be free from stereotypes. More precisely, women's discourse is often delegitimized through media, as they are often presented as victims, unemployed, or anonymous witnesses, but rarely as experts. So female experts are still a minority in French media, and it is worth mentioning that experts or spokespeople are women in only 1 out of 4 cases at maximum. Furthermore, there is a monopolization of public speech and knowledge stakes by men. The media reduce representation of socially weak groups, among which women, thus reflecting the current power relations in our society. So according to Marlène Coulomb-Cooley, this phenomenon became quite evident during this year's presidential elections, where female candidates were often treated quite differently from their male counterparts. For instance, they were systematically interrupted more often. In its 2021 annual report published in July 2022, the ARCOM underlined the fact that there is still an important underrepresentation of women in the French audiovisual media. The report also showed that women were less represented in information programs, while they seem slightly more present in entertainment programs. More precisely, in mainstream media, women journalists are not only still a minority, but they are very often confronted to a gendered distribution of work, as they are very often invited to cover columns that are considered to be less prestigious, or they are assigned less rewarding tasks. Thus, women are mostly assigned to soft news, such as culture, lifestyle, society, etc., while men deal with hard news more often, hard news such as politics, economy, sports, and so on. So, of course, this gender distribution of work also influences gender representations and stereotypes within French media. As far as the representation of minorities in the media is concerned, it is worth mentioning that, as mentioned before, the September 1986 law insists on the representation of the diversity of French society in audiovisual programs in a non-stereotypical way. Thus, audiovisual programs have to reflect, I quote, the diversity of French society. But according to the Barometer of Diversity published by ARCOM, there is a declining presence of people perceived as non-white on television due in part to their underrepresentation in information programs. In addition, people perceived as non-white are more often presented in negative roles than positive ones. More precisely, according to the report, only 18% of people perceived as non-white are represented in positive roles. So if we take into consideration the decrease concerning the representation of people perceived as non-white on television, this finding testifies an important interruption as far as the progress which had been observed since 2020 is concerned, when 36% of roles with positive connotations were back then held by people seen as non-white. Furthermore, the representation of handicap still remains very marginal. I would like to point out that only 0.8% of people represented on screens were identifiable as disabled, when 12 million people, which is approximately 20% of the entire French population, are concerned by one form of disability. So to conclude, I would like to say that there is still a lot of work to do as far as the representation of the diversity in French society is concerned, and the pluralism within the representations.
Thanks, Laurence. Would you say that there is any improvement over the past few years? I feel this is a topic that is now more and more prominent in the public debate, I would expect, but I'm not sure, actually. Is there any particular improvements or not really?
Actually, if we compare to the previous year, where the risk assessment augmented by 14 points. So actually, it is a risk that is much higher than the previous year. So unfortunately, not.
Unfortunately, all right. Thanks, Laurence. If we go on the question of the way news is covered, you may have heard that there's an important major news story at the moment in France. It's everywhere in the public debate, radio, TV, newspapers. It's the pension reform and the many strikes which are taking place to protest against this reform. In light of what was said earlier regarding the public trust, the influence of the political power, Alan, can you tell us how you analyze the media coverage so far, considering that, and I may maybe say a point afterwards, that more actually now both private and public media have stood up actually recently, this past few days, to denounce the way the news has been covered in their own media outlets. Can you tell us as an academic how you see this?
Well, Society of Journalists, yes, maybe take a complaint about the way the owners of the publication, like for instance, the Parisien, cover the social movement in France. It's a long-lasting social movement during from 3 months, about 3 months now. And it's really interesting to take this particular example because we can see how media cover the social movement when there is a social conflict. They have maybe the easiness to take the word of official and make them the truth, or put them more, give them more visibility and more credit. And so this is a problem I think that can be connected to trust in media for the audience. Because the media coverage seems very one-sided, and trust cannot be reinforced by a systematic coverage in favor of officials, rather than a demanding fact-checking of the powerful. And this is something really tricky and hard to discuss because it's still going on, this protest. But this is the same government that pass a law on fake news and the way information is manipulated, but there has been plenty of lies in the way they presented the reform. And so it's hard for journalists to stand against the official words, but there is really a democratic issue here. And the way people are represented or misrepresented could be really a problem. Some even call it administrative journalism, because it does not see at all critical of, it does not seem at all critical of political power. Words of official are rarely fact-checked or contested by journalists, either for public service media like France Info or non-stop private TV channel like BFM. And so it might be easier to work this way for journalists, but it could endanger democracy if citizens doesn't feel really represented by their media.
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, to be precise, so I was referring indeed to Le Parisien. I think I saw this actually this morning, just before we start our discussion. They actually denounced a partisan and pro-government coverage. And a few days ago, it was the public broadcaster France 3, so journalists working there, who denounced the poor treatment of the reform and the fact that too much space was actually given to violence from Black blocs, and not enough space was given to the protesters and to their demands. And also the fact that some media outlets actually didn't really mention or reported about police violence, which we know is also an issue for journalists. And I would refer now to the monitoring work of the Media Freedom Rapid Response on actually monitoring and listing attacks on journalists. And I can say that we actually uploaded a few alerts, as we call them, recently on the Mapping Media Freedom, which is the monitoring platform. But then we see very much like how the media markets, the potential owners, although here actually no one is really the finger is not really pointed at anyone, I must say, in the press releases I could read today, but this is really what's at stake. It's really the quality of information and the trust of the citizen also in in this information. All right, I'd like to thank you very much, Laurence and Alan, unless you have a last word to add on this, but we're soon close to the end. So I'd like to thank you very much for being here today and for having this very interesting discussion. To the audience, if you want to know more about the situation in other European countries, and notably in Slovakia, in Hungary, Bulgaria, and Greece, I'd strongly invite you to stay here and to follow the next discussions, which will address the media capture in those countries. We will also discuss later today the European Media Freedom Act that Julia Cagé also mentions, which is the big European legislation which is in discussion at the moment. And we will discuss actually its role in tackling and preventing media capture in Europe, hopefully. Let's see how the discussion goes. But this is what our expert will be discussing a bit later in this afternoon. So thank you very much for listening, and I wish you a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Hello, Oliver. Do you hear me well? I don't hear you at all, honestly. Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you. Apologies for the slight delay, but it's still 1:15 according to my clock. Welcome, Peter. Welcome to the audience. My name is Oliver Money Curl. I'm the head of European Advocacy at the International Press Institute. We're obviously a member of Media Freedom Rapid Response. Listen, we've only got 15 minutes, so quick introduction to Peter. Peter, you're a Slovak journalist, first and foremost. You work for Aktuality.sk, which is one of the leading independent investigative journalism media websites. Before that, you were an academic and conducted your Ph.D. on media pluralism in Slovakia and the Czech Republic. And before that, you were a journalist with the public broadcast RTV Slovakia. Last year, we got in contact and asked you to help write the next report in IPI's series of country profiles on media capture in Central and Eastern Europe. And we've done them on Hungary, we've done them on Bulgaria, we've done them on the Czech Republic. And now we're about to launch in the coming weeks, thanks to you, Peter, a report on media capture in Slovakia. Can I ask you just to sort of say a few introductory words about what the main takeouts are of the report?
Yes, thank you, Oliver, and hello, everyone. Now, I would say the report is obviously about media capture in Slovakia, and basically what I have found is there is media capture in Slovakia. It's of two kinds. It's the oligarchic media capture and also the political media capture of public service media and some of the institutions. And what's important or special for Slovakia is that is the context. The context that right now many of the politicians connected to the oligarchs with the oligarchs are facing some criminal trials, criminal allegations. This came up after the 2020 elections, and the new government started to fight against the corruption. So now we have a lot of trials involving a lot of politicians, state officials, even the oligarchs. And now, if part of the media is captured, then what we often see is that these actors, the politicians and the oligarchs, are instrumentally using the media to either defend themselves or if that is not really possible, then to at least discredit the institutions like the police or the investigators, the prosecution, even the courts. So I would only briefly answer to this question in this way, that this is the main finding, and it may get even worse. I mean, the media capture right now in Slovakia, if we would try to put it in any kind of numbers, it's not as bad as, for example, in Hungary or Poland. Even the oligarchic capture is a bit lower than in Czech Republic. But well, it might get worse anytime we will get any kind of stronger and more authoritarian player in the politics.
Okay, that's great. I mean, the draft report, as I see, you essentially identify media capture both in sort of private oligarch sector of media, but also in the public broadcaster. So perhaps we can come back to the private sector later on in a couple of minutes. But let's first go to the status of the public broadcaster. And I know you yourself were involved in protests back in, I think, 2018, 2019. And that was really, you know, you present as one of the nadirs of of the state of public broadcasting. But the report also observes how it's gone through different ways and different levels of political interference, depending on the strength of the director general, or the political makeup of the government at the time. I wonder if you could reflect on what the situation is today and what needs to be put in place to strengthen the independence of the public broadcaster.
Yes, well, the institution, the public service radio and television of Slovakia, was criticized under the rule of Mr. Reznik. He was appointed by the previous government, the government that is now often accused of economic crimes. Mr. Reznik, he was criticized by all the journalist organizations all over Europe for basically political media capture of the institution, that he appointed people from the government or governmental offices, the government parties, spokespersons as the heads or the managers of the news. So that was the problem. Nowadays, well, last year he was replaced, or well, his term has ended up, and a new director is elected. He's already in place. And he basically did not change much yet. Well, obviously he had changed the managers, but well, as if I'm going to comment the content of the television, I would say they are still kind of too careful. We have cases showing that they're too careful to criticize not just the government, but basically anyone. They don't want to make any politicians angry, not even those who are facing the criminal trials, right? Why is this? This is not an issue of personal nomination, so it's not something that is going to change with the change of director. It is more a systemic problem, because the system of public service broadcasting in Slovakia and its governance is political, because the parliament, the politicians, the governing majority elects the director general of the institution, and also even more importantly, it's the budget, because well, the broadcaster is not entirely independent. To the contrary, the director has to deliberate with the ruling parties every year over his budget, and now it's even worsening, because they have the politicians have cancelled the direct payments from the audience or the people, and it's going to be entirely dependent on political decisions right now. So this is the problem, and this should be fixed. If there would be a reform, it should aim at these two things that should change and kind of make the public broadcaster more independent.
Okay, so it seems to be a systemic problem, and it also seems that at the moment the public broadcast, although it's compromised, it is not a propaganda. It is not a propaganda outfit as has been developed, for example, in Hungary or Poland. It is more muted and unable, therefore, to hold its political masters to account, and so that is the main problem. I mean, a related issue which the report is interestingly talks about is how the appointments process for whether it's the board of the public broadcaster or for other media regulators, you identify that it's still a highly politicized process, in the sense that those people sitting on the boards are often politically nominated. But there is a level of protection because there is a level of balance or political pluralism within those boards, which prevents any one political force or party from gaining dominance. Is that a good practice model, this sort of form of political balance, or are there weaknesses that need to be addressed?
Well, there is some pluralism in the boards and in media regulators, but it's more a result of I wouldn't say coincidence, but turbulent times in Slovak politics. We had a change of governments, and they have changed some nominees, and some of them had stepped down, etc. So a lot of people changed in the boards, and that's why we have pluralism, because one government appointed these people, another government appointed different people. There were even coalition governments. So in both governments, they appointed people from different parties. So we have a range of parties in the boards. But this, as I have said, is just the result of the turbulence. If Slovakia would have such a strong leader, or maybe a party that would be in power for a longer time, for example, like Fidesz in Hungary, we would end up with equally politically captured boards and media regulators if the politicians would continue this practice. So that is a big risk, I think.
So there's a level of pluralism, but the situation is vulnerable. It is weak and it's vulnerable to be exploited by a dominant political force. Okay, that's really interesting. Let's quickly turn back to the question of the oligarchs, because again, comparatively, Slovakia is relatively pluralistic. There's quite a high level of different actors in the market. But most of them, as in the Czech Republic or other countries, are dominated by oligarchs whose wealth is made often in industries that are supported by the state or funded by the state or regulated by the state. You kind of touched upon it at the introduction. How can these media also hold government to account if their owners benefit from a close relationship to the state?
Yeah, that is very hard. That we already know that the media that are captured by the oligarchs, and the oligarchs are kind of dependent on political decisions. They are never really free. So I'm quite skeptical about this. But I must say two things. You mentioned Czech Republic. We have a lot of the oligarchs that are basically the same guys in Slovakia and the Czech Republic. Also, Andrej Babiš has a newspaper in Slovakia as well, alongside his media businesses in the Czech Republic. There are at least two other media companies that operate on this kind of oligarchic model, both in Slovakia and Czech Republic. So we are mostly talking about the same guys in Slovakia and Czech Republic if we talk about the oligarchic ownership of media. But in Slovakia, they own a little bit less of the market. In Czech Republic, basically all the dailies and all the main outlets are captured this way. In Slovakia, we have several independent outlets. I would say maybe just half of the market is captured when it comes to written news, not televisions. Also, on the television market, we can discuss that separately, but the situation is not as bad as it looks from, for example, the Czech press market. The other thing I must say here is that this kind of media, when oligarchy group involved in corruption scandals is owning the media, they don't really follow any kind of public good or public interest. It looks like a campaign, actually, a campaign against the investigators, the campaign even promoting certain politicians from the opposition currently. So I think I'm very skeptical about this, that anything can be done actually about it, besides of, for example, bigger transparency.
Okay, I mean that's really interesting, because what you're saying is that these owners have purchased the media essentially to serve their own interests, or as you say, they don't purchase for profit; they purchase for influence. I don't know if you
themselves have said that they purchase it for politics, not for profit.
Genta talks about holding the nuclear briefcase, so they can bring it out when they need to, when they're being prosecuted. Look, we've only got a couple of minutes. We can't really talk about Slovakia without talking about the murders of Jan Kuciak and Martina Kušnírová. Obviously, we know that three of the people involved have been convicted. The person who ordered the murder has not been convicted, or is still at large. What do you think would be the impact if the court system were unable to finally convict his murderer or their murderer?
Well, Marian Kočner, one of or maybe the main suspect, he is facing the trial. I mean, it is a retrial at first stage. it was established that there was not enough evidence. Now we are seeing a new trial where we see a little bit more of the evidence. So here I'm quite optimistic that he might get convicted. But well, he is convicted for something else as well. So he is already in prison. So now I think the consequences of him not being convicted of this are not so large or so great or so serious as if the other cases in that I have already mentioned, that a lot of politicians from the previous government, also some of them connected to Kochner, faced trials, because well, all this emerged after the murder. After the murder, the police have acquired Kochner's phone, and they have found a lot of connections to judges, to oligarchs connected to the ruling party, right? So I think these are the more important trials with like if we want to see some kind of or if we want to discuss some kind of consequences for journalists, for example, if these people are not convicted and they are elected again in the elections coming in October this year already, now that might be a real risk for journalism, because these people are some of them slightly pro-Russian, and they have absolutely no respect for some critical journalism, let's say. So I think, and they are really eager to pay the journalists or repay the journalists for all this. So that they blame us for their scandals. They picture us as their enemies.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to have to close it there. There are people queuing up to come in. Slovakia clearly want to watch. There's an election coming up later this year. There'll be a huge moment for, well, not just for the people of Slovakia, but also for journalists. So very good luck for that. Keep an eye out for the launch of this report, which should take place within a month. I would like to now hand over to my colleague Jamie Wiseman, who will be holding the next session on also looking at similar issues on media capture in Hungary, Bulgaria and Greece. Good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining. Straight on to the next session now. Yeah, we have all the panelists, so we can make a move. Thanks to my colleague Oliver from IPI and Slovak journalist and researcher Peter Hanak for their session on media capture in Slovakia. And welcome to all those tuning in for this next panel. Following on from this day's session, in this panel, we have 45 minutes and we'll be looking at media capture in action, taking kind of case studies from 3 different countries within the European Union: Hungary, Bulgaria, and Greece. And to do so, I'm joined now by 3 excellent panelists, 2 of which I can see. Hopefully the third will join in just a second. There's Lambrini.
Oh, sorry. Okay, now I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tamas. Yeah, I'll introduce it there. Joined first by Tamas Bodoky, editor-in-chief of Aktuality.sk, which is a leading independent investigative platform in Hungary, which has been doing some great work in recent years and months. Veleslava Popova, editor at Dnevnik, another leading independent media in Bulgaria. And finally, Lambrini Papadopoulou, the assistant professor at the Department of Communication and Media Studies at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. I'm the host, Jamie Wiseman, Europe Advocacy Officer at the International Press Institute. So just quickly before we jump in, the aim of this session is to understand what media capture looks like in different national media settings, and more importantly, what the kind of implications of this are for media freedom and for independent journalism. And this panel hopefully will set the scene for the following session, which is going to look at the European Media Freedom Act and different efforts to address media capture in its different forms. So as I said, we have 45 minutes for this panel. We'll start with some presentations and case studies from the different countries. Then we'll have an open discussion, and we hopefully have a few minutes at the end for any questions. So if you have anything you would like to ask the panelists, you can put it into the chat and I'll try and read it out to whoever it's best directed at. And again, before we set the scene, I think it's important to just kind of define what we mean by media capture here, so we're all on the same wavelength. So essentially, we're talking about a system of media ownership and control that involves the capture of once independent media by vested political and/or business interests, which then collude to control the narrative and serve their own political or financial ends. And in this kind of symbiotic relationship, media tycoons acquire once independent titles in order to wield influence or to curry favor with the government of the day, whereas the government, of course, benefits from positive coverage in return for kind of state advertising and other financial subsidies. And yeah, research into this topic has identified 4 kind of key pillars of media capture: control over regulatory bodies, control over private media, control over public media, and then misuse of public funds to kind of distort the media landscape in a particular way. And this kind of stealthy takeover of independent media across Central and Eastern Europe in particular, but also other countries like Greece, has really distorted the flow of information and independent journalism. So Tamas, I want to come first to you, with Hungary being, of course, the kind of archetypal media captured landscape. And in the past decade, we've seen the government of Viktor Orban abuse regulatory, legislative, and political and financial tools to really create this kind of pro-government media empire there. So my first question, just to hand over to you, is kind of set the scene. What does the media market in Hungary look like right now, and how entrenched is media capture there? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. So unfortunately, a lot of the features you just mentioned about media capture are present for a long time now in Hungary. Since 2010, we are experiencing this process, what you have just described. It started with the change of the media law, and then the overtake of the public broadcaster, the state-run broadcaster, which in theory should be impartial and non-partisan and non-biased. But in fact, it became a propaganda mouthpiece for the Hungarian government. So basically, the Hungarian government realized that who controls the media will control public opinion and will control the country. Finally, this is not what I'm saying. This is what the political director of our prime minister said openly on a conference recently. So their aim is to control the media, and through the media control public opinion and control politics. So after the public broadcaster, they decided that they also need a private media. So they basically businessmen close to the governing party who benefit from public contracts started to buy media companies and establish media companies to push the government line in these media. And at the same time, independent media or opposition-leaning media or left-leaning media started to have financial troubles, because Hungary is not a real good market, not a good media market, especially not in the serious political press. So the state has always been subsidizing the political press somehow, but before 2010, also government-leaning and opposition-leaning papers got some type of state subsidies like advertisements or state subsidies. And after 2010, the governing party decided that the state should not hand out more money for independent or opposition media. They are exclusively financing the pro-government propaganda media out of the state budget. and they spend a lot of money on this. So billions of forints go into state advertising, and this gets spent almost exclusively on pro-government channels.
Okay, thanks. And I mean, yeah, this kind of system of ownership and the pro-government media empire in Hungary has been well documented, I think, in multiple reports and missions over the years. And I think something that's less focused on are the kind of additional byproducts of a captured media ecosystem, and that media captured by political or business forces can often be used as the attack dogs of a certain political force. I think something happened to you and to your media outlet recently. So yeah, please, if you could just tell us a bit about that and how this attack.
Yes, unfortunately, this is not the first time we are experiencing this. So basically this pro-government media conglomerate, which consists of printed papers, online websites, tabloid papers, radio, and every possible media in multiple channels, they are pretty much centralized. So if the government or the governing party wants to discipline someone or wants to smear or discredit someone, then these channels start to work in unison. And this method is very often used against opposition politicians. So basically lies and half-truths are being said about opposition politicians to discredit them. But in the last few years, this has been also used against journalists as well, and unfortunately, we are one of the outlets which suffer this type of attacks. First time in 2018, when we discovered that the governing party politicians are using a private plane and secretly, and also private yachts on the Adriatic, and we did an investigation about this. They started to attack us and smear us in the pro-government media. And more recently, in this year, January, they attacked us. This time it was about an investigation about how the Hungarian state is spending their state subsidies for minorities, for Hungarian minorities in neighboring countries, which was an IG4EU funded investigation 2 years ago, and we discovered some irregularities about this, but it was basically forgotten since then. And suddenly this January, the pro-government media started a campaign calling us traitors and thugs and mercenaries who are on foreign payrolls, and attack the Hungarian minorities in neighboring countries, which is a very sinister claim in Hungary, and it's clearly not true. It is to discredit our journalism.
Okay, thanks, Tamas. Yeah, I thought that example was really interesting because it really showed the kind of coordinated attack, first from this pro-government foundation, then picked up by the public broadcaster, then swept out to this kind of network.
So basically this went by the book that first pro-government Gongo, government organized NGO, held a press conference about Átlátszó being foreign financed and this creating a national security problem for Hungary. Then this was picked up by the National News Agency, also the leading pro-government daily paper, and then from the National News Agency all through the regional newspapers. So Átlátszó has a pretty limited reach on the internet, and this kind of news get spread in push mode all over the country.
And have those attacks stopped or paused for now, or are you still facing smears, attempts to discredit your work?
No, it stopped, I think, because some international organizations like yours as well did a story on this. I think this is very important that to prevent this type of attacks. And also we sued the national news agency and the leading pro-government newspaper for some of the factual errors they made in their articles, and we won these lawsuits on first instance.
Okay, thanks for that update. Yeah, it's a key illustration of, I think, how a captured media ecosystem can also be kind of interconnected media system, both for pushing out government messages, but also on the flip side for trying to kind of intimidate those voices who remain free from that kind of government interference. So thanks for that. I think we'll turn now over to Bulgaria, which of course displays a very different kind of media captured environment. In Hungary, everything is very, at least in our sense, quite out in the open. Whereas in Bulgaria, I get the sense it's much more kind of wrapped up in competing interests between oligarchs, political parties. And while in Hungary, Bratislava, Fidesz have been in power now for 3 consecutive terms with a supermajority. The situation in Bulgaria is much more volatile, where you have shifting power bases, and one party hasn't really been able to have that time to entrench its own style of media capture. So instead, it's kind of the oligarchs who have owned these media for a long time, using media for their own interests. So yeah, tell us a bit more about the picture in Bulgaria and how it is right now.
Hi, do you hear me well? Okay. I want to start with this, that this Sunday we'll have elections again. For now, it's very unclear who the winner is and if the winner will be a winner, because it's not sure if there will be a chance to form a stable government after the elections. But one of the forecasts put on first place the GERB party, the party of the Boyko Borisov, who run the country for more than 12 years. In the last 2 years, he is not in power, but we still have a lot of the networks and instruments used before that for the media capture and the state capture working. They are not cut and they still have influence. So we'll see what will happen after the elections, because one of the forecasts is that maybe if one coalition is formed, it will be between parties that with the Turkish minority party in Bulgaria, DPS, they are based on the Turkish minority, but always analyzed as a very corporate model party. Their member of parliament is Delian Peevski, who used to be a major media owner and famous oligarch, and who is also sanctioned on Magnitsky case. And maybe the Socialist Party. But if we have a certain kind of government, this will mean no very good times for the media pluralism again. Because in Bulgaria, as I mentioned, the media capture is a result from the state capture. The state capture is based mainly on the influence and control on judiciary system, on a very powerful figure of the general prosecutor. And we are like stuck in discussions and talks and willingness for change from some of the political players, and from resistance from another to do a proper judiciary reform. If this happen in next parliament or in next parliaments, we will see. But until now, the prosecution is still an instrument for influence. And very often in Bulgarian, the punishment is against the owners, not against the journalists, because you can investigate them or freeze their assets, etc. We as a media group, Economedia, Dnevnik and Capital are the main publications famous with their critical position against the power. No matter who is in power, if there is a problems, we have a critical voice, try to do independent investigations, etc. One of our publishers is under how is it? Let's say it was like a cascade of different lawsuits, and part of them are connected with freezing assets, not only his companies and families, but also of the media company. And here is another problem which was not changed in the last 2 years when we'll have now the 5th time elections. So in last 2 years, we do not have a stable government. We have for 5 months a government of a new coalition based on a new party, which was like collecting the hopes for some changes, but they didn't succeed. And one of the things that they didn't succeed is to do changes in the regulator. So on one hand, we have the prosecution, which is influenced by the figure of one man, the general prosecutor. On the other hand, we have most of the regulators in Bulgaria are with members and chairmen who are not changed from in last 2 years. I mean, their mandates are finished. There are people who are from previous influenced by previous governments, so we couldn't expect any rules to be fulfilled in another way than it used to be. And this is like in telecommunications sector, in finance sector. This is also the famous anti-corruption commission in Bulgaria, which is also used as more as an instrument to push people who try to support some new independent parties, people who support media and other. And we still have like a case against us in the commission, although all the cases in the law in the court are finished. So this is how unreformed the system is. And I can give another example with the Council for Electronic Media. The mandate of the general director of the public TV station is gone, but the competition didn't finish with a choice for one of the people who compete for the position. And then some of the participants in the competition, they start again, they open a lawsuit in the court, and now we have the old director with almost maybe he will not we now see the clear end of his mandate, because the Council for Electronic Media said, okay, we will not open a new competition for a general director for the public TV station before everything in court will be finalized. And here again in the council we have like more political and influence of interest than a real law, what law says and what is in public interest. So somehow there were slight changes in the media environment in last 2 years, but again we are under the control of the same, mostly the same people and regulators. And the other problem with the capture, except the system and the regulators, with the financing. The state institution in Bulgaria, as we see also in other countries, they decide where to give the money, and they prefer to give it to the, let's say, more polite media outlets, no matter TV, radio, some of the websites. And until now, we have only the results for 2021, but we again see that for some small media outlets, they have not very big, let's say, injections from state money for advertising or for some communication projects. But for small outlets, they are like enough to exist. It's not a big part of money, but they support them because they know, and this also work very strong for the regional media. You have small teams, small media, supporting the local government, in the local government or the state government carry for them to have money from the state advertising budgets. In 2021, we saw a very interesting phenomenon. It's partly connected with the COVID, but a lot of the money from the state were given through the Ministry of Tourism. So the ministry somehow arranged a lot of campaigns everywhere to advertise the Bulgarian opportunities, although we can discuss was it necessary or not. But this still unfortunately works, how the financing and even the Euro financing is given. I can also mention something which came from all these efforts to control, to capture the media, or even they somehow know, maybe not anymore try to control, but they try to ruin the image of the independent media. This is what we see like a new effort. We are under attack of the Turkish minority party. They go in parliament and directly from the hall of the plenary sessions, they attack our media because we write about the Magnitsky case and put questions, etc. And on another hand, they decline to answer our questions. So institutions and some parties, they stop the access to information. And sometimes this influence our way of how we do journalism. We try to find all the opinions, to present them, etc. But they don't want to speak with us. They don't give us interviews. They don't, even now during the campaign, part of the parties, they don't want to stay in front of our questions. And this access to information is also very difficult in the last years with the prosecution. We sent like maybe hundreds of emails per year and receive 1 or 2 answers. So for example, now in the beginning of the election campaign, we sent questions, how many people were sued, and you have close cases when they were investigate about this is like a trade with votes during the elections. We have this problem with Bulgaria controlling the vote, and we have people who are under investigation that they're selling and buying the votes of the people. And it's 4 weeks and we didn't get any answer. So we couldn't publish this story at all. The other problem I'll mention also one of the nationalists and pro-Russian party, because I think they copy-paste models similar to other countries, maybe influence again from the Russian from Russia. They are Возрождение, and for example, they also said they will not answer us because we have some financing it through a NGO, American NGO. They even stopped the press conference because they said the reporter of Dnevnik should leave, otherwise we will not talk in front of an American media. And they also make an attempt in the last parliament to offer a law about the foreigner agents. You know, I think in other countries also about this. So we'll see from the next parliament, and if we have a government and the parliament have enough time, and how the forces will be in the parliament. We will see what kind of new problems we'll have with media capture, or do we will have some changes that will make the environment for pluralism and independent journalism better. But unfortunately, for example, this nationalist party is rising now with support of the people, and also part of the old parties, they compete for first and third place. So I'll finish here.
Thanks, Yaroslava. Yeah, that's really interesting. And let's hope that the election can result in a party and a government that takes that issue seriously. Whenever we discuss media capture in different countries, it's always amazing to hear the similarities between the kind of national stories, both Bratislava, when you were talking about this kind of isolation and stigmatization of independent journalists in a captured media ecosystem, blocked access to information, to politicians, and from the Greek perspective, really this allocation of state advertising and state subsidies in a way that's highly kind of discriminatory and funneling money to pro-government media, which we'd be really happy to chat about that in Greece now. I think with the focus that's been on media freedom in Greece in the last couple of years, generally, there's also been a slight increase in research and focus being paid to the systemic issues, as well as spyware and the murder of Giorgos Karaibas. But I think it's, maybe Greece has flown under the radar there for a few years. What does the picture look like there? And I know there's an election coming up as well. So what is media capture looking like ahead of the election?
Well, Jamie, first of all, can you hear me? Okay, so I was thinking exactly the same, listening to Tamas and Bratislava. I found so many similarities with what is happening in Greece right now. And I was thinking exactly the same, that indeed the situation with press freedom here was always problematic, but we never would expect that Greece would be behind Bulgaria and Hungary in the recent International Press Freedom Index published by Reporters Without Frontiers. So how did this happen and what role has media capture played? I will try to provide some quick background information and then comment on the current situation. So Greece's media ecosystem has been traditionally characterized by a triangle of power among media owners, politicians, and economic elites. In essence, most media enterprises were not viable on their own, but at the same time, media owners didn't really care about profiting from their media organizations per se. They rather used them as vehicles to exert pressure on political and economic elites so that they could support their endeavors in other fields of Greece's economy, such as constructing. In exchange for this economic help, media owners would provide political support and favorable coverage to political and economic elites. These intervening interests became even more pronounced during the decade-long economic crisis that essentially intensified media's economic dependence on government aid. In order to manage to stay afloat, most Greek media provided ideological legitimacy to the policies of austerity, sustained and reproduced the hegemonic neoliberal agenda. Nevertheless, austerity led to the closure of several media outlets, even of some media conglomerates. This restructure created some hopes that the situation would change and new independent outlets would fill this void. Instead, although we did have independent media, but the majority, what happened was that new media owners entered the field and in essence replicated the same situation. So today, despite a large number of media outlets, a few leading players continue to dominate the scene and account for the majority of digital television and national newspaper market. Both of the previous speakers spoke about their country's public broadcaster, and I would also like to make a special mention to ERT, which is Greece's public radio and television broadcaster. And I think I found it very interesting that according to relative literature, ERT is still considered by many as state rather than a public broadcaster. This wide public perception stems from ERT's one-time role as a mouthpiece of government propaganda. Things are not very different today, as despite the existence of relevant law provisions in practice, ERT's president, CEO, and members of the board of directors are selected and appointed by decision of the relevant minister. Right now, for instance, ERT's president is the former manager of the press office of the leading party, New Democracy. Moreover, the government placed ERT and the country's only press agency under the direct control of the state, a practice that has been condemned by the Council of State. In another recent development, the government decided to increase the number of members of the news agency's board from 7 to 9, with the 2 additional members to be appointed by the government. thereby further strengthening its control over the news agency. So what is the impact of this oligopolistic dominance of the media market in combination with media capture? In essence, limits structural pluralism and constitutes a threat to the diversity of information. Specifically, what we see again and again happening is that news that is inconvenient or unflattering for the Greek government does not get reported in many outlets. This tendency was also depicted in Media Freedom Rapid Response's last mission in Greece. The title of the report, Controlling the Message, describes exactly the widespread climate of submission that has dominated the media field in the recent couple of years. Essentially, media capture leads to the promotion of an one-sided narrative in favor of the government and the exclusion of critical voices. Jamie, you did mention the role of government aid to media capture, and just like Velislava mentioned, our government tried to intensify media capture by providing state support only to those media that reproduced its own agenda. Specifically, during the COVID-19 outbreak, it distributed 20 million euros to media outlets for them to carry stay-at-home public health messages. As it was later found out, outlets critical of the government had received less than 1% of the total sum. And specifically, an anti-government outlet, Documento, was excluded outright from the funding. Moreover, some of the money were given to non-existent websites. I have also some more examples. I don't know if you would like me to talk about them right now, or perhaps wait for a discussion with the rest of the speakers.
Yeah, we can maybe have that as that issue of state advertising and financial aid as a kind of open session. But yeah, exactly what you were talking about, Lambrini, about this kind of exclusion of certain problematic topics or media discourse just ignoring really kind of important public interest issues. In Greece, I saw, at least in my own perspective, two kind of examples of this in the last year. The first being about the spyware cases against journalists, which when it was just the Greek financial journalist, Thanasis Koukakis, it was largely ignored in the media until the opposition leader was surveilled as well. And then also around the recent tragic Greek train disaster. After that, we saw a big period of frustration and questioning, but also looking at the media's role in that, with a lot of independent media showing that they had covered it, but it either wasn't picked up, wasn't reported in more national influential media, or just the topic generally being ignored. So would those be two pertinent examples? And I guess there must be many more.
Yes, exactly. There are many more examples, but I think that these two that you mentioned are quite indicative and very frustrating about press freedom in Greece. The first one, as we call it, the Predator Gate, or the Greek Watergate, it's also dubbed like that. Indeed, no fewer than 13 Greek journalists are said to have been targeted by the spyware Predator that has been reportedly acquired by the Greek intelligence services. And these cases constitute major violations of the affected journalists' privacy, journalistic source protection, and press freedom in general. And I think that what is most impressive is the fact that until now, Greek authorities have refrained from conducting a swift, thorough, and transparent investigation into the surveillance of these journalists. Another more recent and very tragic incident had to do with an accident last month. 57 people, most of them young people between the ages of 20-25, were killed in a train collision that was the deadliest in Greece's history. Greece's Prime Minister attributed this accident to a tragic human error. However, it was later revealed that representatives of rail unions had been warning and had been yelling for many years about the government's neglect of railway safety systems and protocols. Nevertheless, these warnings never made it to the headlines, as most media chose not to reproduce them because they would criticize the government.
Thanks. Yeah, I think those are really two kind of key examples. And yeah, Bratislava mentioned as well, really, the election context as, I guess, a moment in the media ecosystem where media capture is at its most acute, and the reasons for that capture are most utilized in terms of political narratives. And I think the election in Greece is coming up in May now.
Exactly. Yeah.
How do you see media capture impacting the election campaign and political messaging there?
Well, it is still quite early to have a final conclusion. I think that we will be able to talk about the way that media capture has affected the way that elections are represented, and after the end of the elections. For the time being, what we see is that the one scandal comes after the other. Regarding various people in the government or the leading party or the other government, the rest of the parties, and that most of the media try to put forward the government's agenda and present the government in a more favorable way. But it's still quite early to have a conclusion about this issue.
Jamie, may I add an example? For example, because it comes from our elections codex and it was changed by the politicians. The public broadcasting media now during the elections campaign have so kind of rules to give the equality and the objectivity let's say for all the parties and coalitions that compete for the next parliament. So in the public broadcasters, you can watch programs where everybody can say everything, and the anchors are not, they don't behave as a journalist, but only like as moderator, giving the word and counting the seconds, because for example everybody has 10 minutes and should have his 10 minutes in which, for example, you can see a leader of a small and strange party to say that people from Mars will attack us, and nobody say nothing. But okay, let's say you can consider this as a joke, but other people use it for pro-Russian propaganda, conspirational theories, and other directly in the broadcasting. And also there are money from state to give the chance for every of this party to be on TV or on the public radio, and also they can decide for some other media. And if you check the numbers where the money of the parties go in the media through the campaign, you can again see that the so-called independent or more critical or quality media, they almost do not have any advertising budget from the parties.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Maybe just to circle back to you, Tamas, for the last word before we wrap up. After listening to the kind of the case studies of those two countries as well, were there similarities that you saw from Hungary in terms of public broadcasting or state advertising?
I heard a lot of similarities. For example, in Hungary, we had the same situation with the oligarchs who do business with the state, and in return they run some media and they use this media to influence politics. But in Hungary, we have taken a step forward, because all these oligarchs decided to donate their media basically to a central foundation, a pro-government foundation, which runs now hundreds of media outlets in a centralized manner. So basically, I think the politics won over the oligarchs, and the oligarchs lost this weapon against government politics. And now government politics controls directly this media, not through the oligarchs. So this is one of the similarities. The other one is, of course, the elections. So the elections is when this media capture situation is the most visible. In Hungary, it's almost ironic how media situation through the elections. So before the elections, there is a huge government campaign out of taxpayers' money, pushing so-called government messages, so public messages, which then resonate to the governing party's election messages. So basically, in Hungary, the Hungarian state and the governing party is not really distinguishable anymore.
Okay, thanks, Tamas. We're just about to run out of time, so we'll call it there, I think. We've obviously taken three quite negative case studies here, but I think it's always important to note after this that there are really amazing independent and investigative journalists in both all of these three countries trying to do their work free from pressure and threats and financial issues as well. And there are reform efforts happening across Europe now as well. In the previous session, Peter was mentioning a little bit about the reform of the government there, and that they passed recently changes which increase the transparency of media ownership in Slovenia and the Czech Republic. There are efforts underway to increase the independence of the public broadcaster to safeguard it from future capture. So there are positive things and positive examples. But I think it's really important to look at the worst case scenarios as well in Europe. And hopefully that'll lead on to the next discussion, which again is hosted by my colleague Oliver, which is going to look at the EMFA, the Media Freedom Act, which is largely designed to try and address some of these issues, or at least we hope it will. So we'll hand over to Dev now. Thank you again to all the panelists, Tamas, Lambrini, and Bratislava. Thanks to everyone watching as well, and please tune in for the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi everyone.
We have everybody. Hello, Olaf. Can you hear me?
Very well.
I had some technical problems on the last session.
No worries.
Right,
Let me close the door. I'll be right back.
It looks like we have everybody, so we can start. Well, welcome back, everybody. My name's Oliver Monaco. Again, I'm head of European advocacy at the International Press Institute. Look, we've had a really interesting afternoon so far, hearing about the problems of media capture. Firstly, in France from Julia Cage, and then in Slovakia, and most recently we've been hearing about the situations in Greece, in Bulgaria, and in Hungary. And of course, we've seen a whole range of the different issues that are raised by media capture. We've been talking about this to the European Commission for several years and asking them to intervene or to try to solve some of these problems. And they've always responded, well, we don't have the legal tools. We don't have the legal tools to deal with the delicensing of Club Radio or PKN Orlen's takeover of Polska Press in Poland. In September, they came up with their answer by launching the European Media Freedom Act. In this session, I think we really want to try to get into some of the details about the many different articles and try to work out whether or not the Act really is going to meet some of the ambitions that have been placed before us, and whether it will have the tools to be able to help counter media capture, to help preserve media pluralism, to defend editorial independence in the newsrooms, and to end the surveillance of journalists who are doing their jobs. To do so, we have three individuals who are playing a leading role in shaping our thinking around these issues and arguing about the finer details of what should or should not be in the Act. We have one of the authors of the Act, Aldris Pakauskas. You're deputy head of unit at DG Connect, and you've spent much of the last 6 months defending the Act, explaining the Act, deflecting criticisms of the Act, while also, my impression is, trying to find some of the solutions to the issues that have been raised by organisations such as ourselves and member states, etc., to try to work out what needs to be changed and compromised. We also have Renata Schroeder, who's director of the European Federation of Journalists. You represent, I think, that some 200,000 journalists now across Europe in journalist unions, and as such, you are very much.
Excuse me, many more, dear Oliver.
I'm sorry, but you can update us. 200,000 plus. The point is, you are the voice of working journalists across Europe, and of course, you've spent the last 6 months, well, I guess, first of all, analysing, consulting with your members, developing a position, and then, of course, advocating for a much stronger Media Freedom Act. And then we have Olaf Steinfeld, who you're the founder and the director of the Global Media Registry, which of course is an instrument for dealing with one of the key issues raised in the Act about how we get proper transparency over media ownership, and so all the sort of technical challenges involved in that. And of course, you know, for the previous few years, you've been working closely with Reporters Without Borders on their Journalism Trust Initiative, which is another form of instrument which is very close to trying to deal with many of the issues that the EMFA is also trying to deal with. What I'd like to do is to sort of have just give you all a chance to have 2 or 3 minutes for an introductory sort of comments, and then we will try to address some of the sort of more difficult or trickier articles that have been where there have been lots of sort of arguments and debates from different stakeholders in the Act. Before I do that, just a quick comment to the audience. Remember that you can post questions in the chat, and hopefully I will be able to come. We'll have a bit of time. We've only got 45 minutes. I'm not promising, but we may have a bit of time to come and address some of those questions. I mean, first of all, I'll turn first of all to Olaf, and I'm going to look very sort of briefly. You know, how is the EMFA? Is the EMFA able to address some of these issues that we've heard this afternoon?
Yes, hello everyone, and thanks for having me. So maybe initially it's worth just stating the obvious, and this is that the European Union actually does have a very small, to put it politely, very small mandate only in the sector of media policy, and stepping up its profile in this domain, I think, is obviously also triggering the respective responses from member states, and we can only guess why member states are so why it's so important for them to keep media policy within the realm of national policies. Maybe I can speak a little bit to one of the main pillars of the MFA, which is transparency, namely transparency of media ownership. And maybe just, again, stating the obvious, I think it's important to say that transparency, it's not an end in itself, but it's important to know why we are asking and demanding more transparency. What's the purpose of this? And then basically measuring the MFA against these purposes and what we would like to achieve as European citizens. And this also, I think, relates to at least our understanding that transparency has legitimate limits. I mean, we've seen this with the recent court ruling in the field of privacy, but also we should maybe take into account that media is a very competitive industry, where also there are legitimate limitations to what companies can disclose in order to operate successfully and thrive in this very competitive environment. I think there are three main purposes for transparency that MFA is, it seems, pushing for. One is probably a no-brainer, and that's media literacy, like providing additional information for the general public. I think what we've seen so far, and also what MFA is prescribing or recommending, is falling short, mainly because I think it's pretty clear that just the name of an ultimate beneficial owner or of a company is pretty meaningless to the average citizen, but you need context. You need to explain what this means. You need to explain what the affiliated political and economic interests behind media ownership and control over public opinion are in order to make sense for the general public. The second purpose, and this is also which is mentioned in the MFA quite extensively, is the regulatory realm. So we speak about concentration control, which is the antidote of media pluralism. And again, I think the main challenges working in this space for several years is not so much the requirement as such, but really meaningful metrics. Just to give you one example, cross-media reach and audiences are still very hard to measure and compare. If you have one publisher that runs traditional radio and television, a legacy newspaper, plus online websites with a combined audience of X, how do you compare this publisher with a pure player online website in a meaningful way? And this sounds very technical, but is at the core of implementing this. And this is where I think we still have quite a long way to go. And this is maybe even more important when we speak about metrics and indicators about the kind of cross-border dimension of concentration, because the traditional remit of regulatory authorities is domestic, but media concentration has a strong regional dimension as well. And many actors in this space are operating across borders. And this is where national regulatory authorities usually fall short of any kind of meaningful work when it comes to this larger picture. And maybe thirdly, real quick, the third purpose of transparency would be fighting disinformation. Quite clearly, you need to know who is behind and running certain accounts when it comes to influence operations. Again, this is not a national task. The main question here and challenge would be interoperability, where the MFA is putting a lot of hope, it seems, on the board to come, maybe, but only to facilitate and promote interoperability, common standards, for example, which sounds nice, but enforcing them is obviously a totally different ballgame. And I think this is what really matters. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Enough. I mean, that's a really good start. You start by questioning the entire mandate of the Commission to put on the MFA, and then also you touch on the very sort of practical questions which aren't addressed in the MFA about how you make something meaningful. I mean, look, let's go to Eldris now, because as I said, you're one of the brains behind the EMFA. You've been responsible in trying to, get together an EMFA that both gives the powers to make a difference. We know this is a response to the crisis we've seen in Hungary and the Czech and in Poland and in other countries as well. But you've got to find the right balance between having something that can make a practical difference and also without stepping over the mandate or somehow potentially sort of going into an area which we don't quite have the tools to deal with. How do you measure media pluralism issues effectively? How do you get the right sort of balance between privacy and transparency of ownership, editorial independence? I mean, these are obviously key issues that are going to come up in this conversation, I trust. So perhaps Eldris, perhaps you'd like to give us a bit of insight to that, and also where you think the EMFA, if you're allowed to tell us, where you think there will be compromises, where you think there will be that it may be strengthened when the Commission comes back with updated versions.
Thank you, Oliver. So indeed, a few words about the construction of the Media Freedom Act. So we tried, the ambition was to achieve something useful and tangible without, as you say, pretending that as a Commission we have a limitless mandate in the media field. So this is why, it's a peculiar construction, because it consists of a proposal for a regulation and also recommendation. And then in the proposed regulation, you have a mix of more detailed provisions and slightly less detailed provisions, and an institutional structure, mainly in the form of a board for media services to support those provisions. So all of this is explained precisely by our balancing act. So balancing between what we can do and what we think we have to do to help media function in a more independent way across the European Union. And let's say that the issues which we cover in the proposed Media Freedom Act are also quite different and of different nature. We have provisions which link quite a lot with your discussions on media capture. So there are provisions requiring member states to abstain from interfering with editorial independence of media service providers. There are similar provisions, but going a little bit in greater detail on regulatory measures that are put in place by member states. There are provisions calling on media companies themselves to find appropriate measures to strengthen independence of editorial decisions internally. There are provisions mentioned by Olaf on transparency of media ownership. There are provisions also about state advertising to make sure that it's distributed fairly and in a transparent way. So there's a big block of provisions which you could call about strengthening editorial independence and trying to prevent media capture situations. Then there is another block of provisions indeed about media concentration and the so-called media pluralism test with envisaged opinions from the board in cases where media concentrations are more significant and also significant from the internal market point of view. And on media concentrations, perhaps just one observation. We also tried to take a balanced approach, meaning that we realize that on the market, lots of transactions and concentrations are happening, and they are very different because sometimes media service providers perhaps need to emerge from the economic point of view, because the economic environment for media is not necessarily very favorable. Some are more successful in taking up digital opportunities, some are perhaps less, and perhaps would only be successful if they joined forces with other media outlets. So this is why in this media pluralism test we also we have several criteria. So both the impact on media independence and pluralism, but also the impact on economic sustainability. And then there are several pieces of ENFA which are relevant for the digital space and how media content is circulating in the digital space. So of course the much discussed Article 17 about about the additional safeguards for media when their content is distributed by online platforms, but also two other provisions that are relevant for the digital realm. So one is about the ability of users to customize their audiovisual offer on connected TVs and similar user interfaces, and also audience measurement. I would still, it's not necessarily only digital, because audience measurement exists for a long time, but we tend to attribute this to the digital chapter because we see a bit less transparency and inclusivity when it comes to developing audience measurement methods in the online space. So this is why we thought that this is relevant primarily for digital distribution of media content. So this is what we have on the table, and going forward, look, right now it's not so easy actually to see all those landing zones where different provisions might end up, because we have council with all the member states expressing their views and proposing their changes to the provisions on the table. In the European Parliament, we have 3 committees dealing with it: the lead Culture and Education Committee, but also Internal Market Committee and LIBE. They have important roles and to play in this whole process. So all in all, let's say our expectation is that that most probably there won't be dramatic changes, in a sense that, you know, completely different structure of a proposal, or suddenly completely different institutional structure to help with implementation of a provision. So probably we will stay broadly speaking, we will stay with what we have on the table. But of course, inevitably you could expect some strengthening here and there, or some weakening here and there. So for example, on public service media, I don't know, let's see, because some member states feel strongly about public service media. So perhaps instead of provisions applicable directly to public service media providers, perhaps member states will succeed in rephrasing them into provisions obliging themselves, so member states to do something. Or going in the opposite direction, there are question marks around again, talking about media capture. So okay, you have some safeguards and media pluralism test for new concentrations and transactions on the market, but sometimes people say, okay, so what about existing situations where media is concentrated, and concentrated not necessarily for economic reasons, and where we have already a grains of a solution in the form of annual monitoring exercise, which has to specifically look into market concentration. But then we have to see, perhaps as a result of all discussions and ideas circulating, there will be some extra step to look into existing concentration. So these are just 2 examples. I'm sure there will be more also on Article 17 and online platforms. So let's say the story, I think, will continue in an interesting way. Thank you, Oliver.
Well, it will run and run, but hopefully not forever. And thank you also for the insight into the sort of political process. I mean, we realize you've drafted it, but in a way you've kind of handed it over, and now it's up to the sort of the politicians to sort of to sort of play with it and scribble all over it, and hopefully make it, you know, hopefully strengthen it, not weaken it. Let's see what happens. Lots of issues coming up. I think we're going to keep coming back to this question of pluralism and concentration and how you regulate this and how you measure this, because it's, and you know, the incredible fast pace of the way the media sector has changed, and the mandate Olaf, you talked about cross-border ownership, and yet one of the sort of publishers, you know, criticisms of this is they say, well, you know, these are all national markets, it's not a European market. In terms of its mandate, you know, we actually now know that not only the European Commission legal service, but both the Parliament and the Council's legal service have confirmed that it does have a mandate to do this. So we can move on from that point, whether or not we agree with it. But look, let's move to Renata. It'd be really good just to give you your quick overview. What are the big points that the EFJ is fighting for? Where are your red lines, and what's the minimum that you would demand from the what will emerge, how the EMFA emerges from this process?
Thank you, Oliver. Also, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, first I have to say, I think I haven't worked in my long career on such a docile on such a project for such a long time. We are having at the moment an intern who's following how co-legislation works, and I think it's a very interesting example indeed. Let me just say three things before I give you some details regarding contents where we think it's very, very important to strengthen. I think it's three things which are important, looking a little bit more globally at that. First, to repeat again, it's been very important also as a political symbol, this move by the European Commission, with all the reasons you explained before, how difficult it is to deal with media. Being German, I know how difficult it is with the federal system, but the more important it is that we are doing it. And I think the recognition of the European Commission, finally, that journalism is a public good is very important. And that by itself demands economic, but also regulatory normative mechanisms to protect journalism as a public good, of course, with arm's length. And the second point is, I think, what we really ask now, being a regulation with direct national effect, is to be coherent, to be precise, to be enforceable with legal certainty. That we find is very important, and the issue of enforcement, of course, is crucial. We have to know who at national level will enforce that. We need full transparency here. We are a bit surprised that some MEPs who talked about division into directive, which is more principle-based and regulation, now say this regulation has to be principle-based. For us, this is not enough, and I think it's a contradiction in terms, but I keep it on that for now. The third point is, and that is very important for that, this is a unique occasion to finally enforce Council of Europe standards and recommendation into national law. We all know member states are members, have signed the European Convention of Human Rights, specifically Article 10 on protection of sources. They have signed everything regarding media transparency, public service media, but as so very often it hasn't been implemented. So I think this is the moment to do that and get something concrete at national level. Coming to some of the articles, Oliver, you said, which are very important for the journalist perspective, for the EFJ and all the other media freedom organizations, and I just mentioned 4 here. One is protection of sources in Article 4 and surveillance. Of course, we all know protection of sources is a cornerstone of media freedom. When journalists cannot ask their sources anymore, when they are afraid or sources are afraid of telling journalists, then we have a big problem. And there is already also, when it comes to surveillance, quite a bit of censorship. So what we ask here, and we are a little bit, to be honest, disappointed by the Commission text because it's not in line with the Council of Europe standards. For example, what is crucially important that it is the ex ante provision that you have to go to the courts before you're allowed to go into the newsrooms or to take the sources. It cannot be that it's the police officers or any intelligence services who do so. And that has to be made much clearer in the text. The same regarding surveillance. We talk about a lot about Pegasus surveillance at the moment, but there is much more, and we need a future-proof mechanism for all the mechanisms that may come. We also need encryption for journalists. Journalists have to protect themselves from the outset. I think on that one, it's fair to say, and I'm very happy that we have the publishers and we have the broadcasters, private and public, on our side. Unfortunately, we don't have the member states on our side for reasons we probably can guess. The second point is the famous Article 6.2. I think famous because this is the one many publishers, but not all, have some problems with. For us, it is a very important article with some changes. I think it can really help journalists to protect themselves from undue interference. We know from Council of Europe reports and others that there has been in recent years an increase in undue interference, also economically wise from the advertisement people, not only political wise, and we need to strengthen that. I think it's very clear that we also have to protect the publisher's line. Nobody is against that. So what we ask is that editorial decisions must be protected, not individual editorial decisions. And we are coming with some clear amendments on that. What is written in the text, it always says measured appropriate to the media service providers. Sorry. So I do not understand that they keep saying, well, the Commission wants to do a fits-all approach. No, it's very clearly written that it has to be decided what and how it's being done, but we need that very much. The third point is, as Olaf already mentioned, of course, transparency. And I do not, of course, media companies compete with each other, but to be honest, I don't see the point here, because we see it in the Nordic countries. We see it in many countries. They completely follow the transparency line. They do that and they compete nevertheless. Where we have problems is, of course, owners who are oligarchs, who have obscure beneficial owners at the side. But those who do it and those who are healthy to compete, I think it only gives more trust to the media companies we want to protect. And the last and not least point, and I think there the nice thing that we all agree, besides the Commission, but both member states, the European Parliament and the media stakeholders we work is a more independent board. We find this makes complete sense. It's coherent. When we want national regulators to be independent, we also need at European level a board that is completely independent from the European Commission. So these are the main points. I don't want to go too much into minimums because we are here to strengthen it, as you said. We don't know what's happened. That's why we are working all day and night at the moment, because we need it urgently. And as Vera Jourova yesterday said, if it's really a legacy of Daphne and Jan Kuciak, there is much more to be done. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Renata. I'm already broadening out onto many more issues. And I'm glad you raised this question about the principle-based regulation, not least because we have a question in the chat that was directed at Aldris about, if you could explain the principle-based regulation quite clearly. Renata, you've expressed an objection to that because you need legal certainty, and I think that's really clear. We've talked a lot about media ownership, transparency, media pluralism already. Very specifically, what the Act does, as I read it anyway, is that it introduces some sort of voluntary levels of media ownership. I say voluntary, I don't mean that. I mean, there is an obligation to provide transparency over ownership, but only to audiences. There's no sort of Europe-wide mechanism for verification and authentication, and also sort of bringing this all together, doing the sort of mapping that Olaf does. But it is at least there. It is a requirement, which is really important. And then the second thing it does is it requires that when there are mergers, and I guess the antitrust authorities at the national level, that they are required to review the impacts of any merger, not just on economic or competition grounds, but also on media pluralism grounds. So it's introducing principles without actually getting into the nitty gritty about how we define media pluralism and how we assess that. In terms of its tools, though, the board, when it thinks that there's a problem in a member state on media ownership or media pluralism, the only tool it has available is to issue an opinion. So I guess my question, well, first of all, would be to Oldris, but also that then more broadly, what is the point? How does that opinion actually advance us in difficult issues or difficult countries where you actually want to say, okay, this is a very clear breach of compromise on media pluralism that is going to put an enormous amount of power, extra power into the hands of, let's say, the government, let's say in Hungary, if it can't actually intervene and prevent it. So what is the point, and what at least does it serve by doing this? Aldris.
Yes, thank you, Oliver. So indeed, for this very pertinent question. So first of all, it's all these board opinions is about putting the finger on the problem and somehow authoritatively spotting the problem and explaining that it's a problem and raising it also to European level. So in itself, it's already, we hope that at least in member states which are to some extent receptive to constructive criticism coming, from Brussels, that they might act and themselves, let's say, do the necessary corrections. But then another dimension is that, of course, Media Freedom Act is not functioning in isolation. So for a number of years, we have been building or involved in building some other relevant structures, notably the annual rule of law report of the Commission. And that report is also evolving. It started more or less like a factual overview of developments in all the countries of European Union. And in the meantime, it is developing more in the direction of making also recommendations to each member state, and then following up, seeing how those recommendations are implemented. So you could see in the future some interesting links emerging whereby the board would, for example, assess a particular market concentration, perhaps would raise issues, perhaps would point to the necessary safeguards to be put in place in the context of that concentration. And then, of course, we would have another look, I'm pretty sure, in the context of a rule of law report, if that is an important issue, and would come back to the member state with recommendations, then would follow up upon implementation of those recommendations. And okay, if the situation is extremely dramatic and goes as far as infringing EU law, then of course the ultimate tool is always infringement procedures, which the Commission can launch. So in other words, I'm not pretending that what we have on the table, is the machine to produce binding decisions immediately applicable in the member states concerned. But what I want to say that even with this relatively soft touch approach, there is a path to achieve tangible results. And indeed, let me use this opportunity also to confirm what Renate said, that it's important with the Media Freedom Act to keep detailed provisions where we can and avoid an entirely principle-based regulation, because simply it would not work properly in practice if in all the fields covered by the regulation we would have only principles.
I think I can certainly see how, by the board producing these reports, you develop a body of work on in countries where there is an obvious crisis. So, for example, take Hungary. There is the Article 7 process. There are a whole list of things that are now required of the Hungarian government to do to reform their rule of law crisis. Not one of them deals with media, which is astonishing. Perhaps if the board had been in place and had issued these reports, maybe then the sort of political will in the council may have been there to address it. So I do see a link. I do see how it can how it can work. I mean, just let's quickly sort of touch on this question from the publishers, concern about the sort of having a sort of media plurality test at all, because again, their principle is this is none of the Commission's business. These are national markets. We need to grow in order to consolidate, to compete against the platforms. So they've been trying to push this out, but also they've now come back with an alternative, which say, well, if there is to be a media plurality test, it should also look at the size and power and audience, I suppose, of the platforms. I wonder, just Ola, perhaps you'd like to comment on that. Is that a good thing? Should that be part of a media plurality test, or should it not? Because if you do that, then effectively, you are giving the green light to media giants, trans-European media giants, which would be necessary to compete against the Googles and the Metas or Facebooks of this world.
Well, yes, this echoes a little bit what was said earlier, that concentration can actually also be a good thing when it comes to building national or European champions on the world stage. So fair enough. I always feel a little bit of a cringe when I hear the word publishers, because it kind of seems a little bit like a far cry of the saying like press freedom is the freedom of 200 mostly white men owning a printing press. And of course, what we talk about in the digital economy is actually large platform operators that do traditional publishing, advertising business, broadcasting, online services all together. So I think the term publishers is really a little bit misleading here. And when it comes to the plurality test, I think what's a little bit missing in the discussion, and this comes again down to the point of enforcement and practicalities. Concentration and pluralism in a market of the size of Malta or Montenegro, by definition, is a totally different ball game than in France or, let's say, in India. And the problem here is what is the measurement looking like? What are the criteria for supply side pluralism and internal pluralism in a publishing group, for example? I mean, Sweden, for example, is a very concentrated market and relatively small, but it's very pluralistic because there's a lot of internal pluralism in the different, regardless if it's public broadcasting or commercial media, within these entities. And I think this needs to be taken into account.
I'm really glad you made the points about the publishers, because in some of the powerful publishers groups who call themselves publishers, who have been very hostile to this, one of the arguments they make is the German publisher, for example, is they say, well, we've never had regulation of the print in Germany. That is totally against the foundations of our democracy and the freedom of expression. And any attempts, therefore, to have some form of regulation of print and publishing will threaten what has worked extremely well for the last 50 or 70 years. And yet, as you point out, well, that's just not an image, that's an image of the media market that simply doesn't exist. And in a way, the DSA or the EMFA are efforts to start putting together the building blocks of some kind of regulation that is fit for the digital age. I think, I don't know if any of you listened to Julia Cagé earlier, but she was really interesting in talking about, and I think this is some things that Olaf, you've also talked about good governance, whether that's a public broadcasting or good governance of media, whether that's big media or a small media. And I wonder, Renata, if you could perhaps sort of touch on this, because this also relates to the editorial independence that I know is really important for you. And how do you find the right models, and how can the EMFA first of all help promote those right models, and how can you promote those kind of models around the world. Julia Cagé was talking about, some of the French traditions about journalists being able to vote and approve for new owners or investors, or the new editors-in-chief, and these types of things. She talks about VAT reductions for media that are more transparent, that are prepared to offer those levels of transparency that, Olaf, you said maybe some may feel against their business interests. Well, maybe, are these other tools that can be used? I wonder, Renato, I'm conscious we've got about 6 minutes left, and there are a couple more questions I want to come back to.
Oliver. Well, yeah, I actually just wanted to, I won't go now into the new business models and all there is. I think that's not, today we're talking about MFA, but I really wanted to say two things. Once, it's clear the Media Pluralism Monitor showed that media pluralism in most countries is at high risk. Second, I also understand that it's not so easy and it's not possible at European level now to have very, very clear rules. I understand that, and also many of our members wouldn't like to have it for the reasons also Olaf announced. What is interesting at the proposal we have on the table at the moment is this public interest test for media mergers. It's this sort of peer review that exactly discussed not each media concentration is potentially dangerous. You have to do this public interest test. In some countries, like in Ireland, it already exists. What will be very important is there the board will also extend its dialogue, discuss it, also include civil society, academia, journalists, actors, and what have you, in people like Julia Cagé in those discussions. What I'm afraid of, what's happening at the moment, that many larger media stakeholders are afraid of such a public interest test, and therefore they want to cross the term media market concentration or media. They just reduce it to market test, market concentration, and as Oliver, you said, include the VLOPs, the very large online platforms. But that, in my view, dilutes it all. We do not even need such a test anymore. So it's a very smart way to get rid of that. And I think that would be a pity, because such peer review is also raising awareness at European level. It's setting standards. And in our view, it is very important.
Oh, Olaf, I see your hands up. You obviously want to respond.
Yes, just very briefly. I mean, yes, political will is great, but at one point we really need to talk about enforcement. And I may just contribute like two main points from the engine room, let's say, of running projects around these topics, where we might also see a few glitches in the MFA at the moment. So one is the focus on news and current affairs. When it comes to fighting foreign influence operations and disinformation, because quite clearly a large vector of foreign influence operations are genre related to entertainment, music, even sports. And this, I think, needs to be taken into account when it comes to, for example, ownership transparency. Sometimes these genres are even more efficient and impactful because they're more subtle when it comes to projecting soft power. The second point is about editorial independence, which, for example, pops up in Article 17. Obviously, editorial independence is not binary. It's not you are independent or you aren't. And then you need some sort of criteria how to define this. If you take a very fundamentalist approach, probably 90% of media in Europe would not be independent, because there are, of course, some sort of dependencies, mainly in the economic realm, not so much like straight from the state or the government, but powerful, economic interests, then kind of indirectly related to, obviously, governments and political stakes as well. And again, when it comes to enforcement, I think these questions need to be addressed. Thank you.
I mean, it was interesting, because I was going to come back to you as the very last question to talk about an article which has rarely come up actually in the discussions I've been involved in. This is Article 16, which uniquely has been put in there as what I assume is to provide a legal process by which, for example, the decision to ban RT and Sputnik was taken, and this is an effort so that you have the European board would be able to issue a recommendation on when a media company based in a third country its content or its broadcasting threatens I forget the exact term, but the sort of public safety or security within the EU. And you, of course, have worked a lot on this, also with RSF. And I wonder if you could comment, does that article do what it aims to do, or should it be doing more to counter disinformation, foreign disinformation?
Very briefly, I think the most obvious targets here are the least problematic. And obviously also the sanctioning of RT and Sputnik was a lot of like rapid response type of window dressing. And like you say, it sounds a little bit like retrospectively covering one's neck. On the front of foreign influence operation, I think the most problematic accounts are the ones that are not related to traditional media outlets, which pretend to do news, current affairs. So this is where I think it's probably falling short of this goal.
Okay, well, a lot of issues have fallen short of this call. We are now out of time. I think what I've learned is that this is much more complex than we really want to admit. But that the EMFA is at least an effort that is going, it is starting out on putting together those building blocks. Maybe it is just identifying the principles around which governments who want to build at the national level, some of the rules, some of the laws, some of the tools to address this can do that, with knowing that they've got a sort of a set of European-wide standards that they can meet. So I think there's also a political element to this. But look. Sadly, we are out of time. So thank you very much for joining us. The next session starts in about 14 minutes. It's an interview with Maris Dragomir, who is one of the sort of, how should I describe, one of the sort of academic experts, if you like, in sort of defining media capture and hopefully some of the solutions to that. So don't miss it. Thank you once again and have a fantastic weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Oliver. Thank you,
Bye.
Renate. Thank you, Olaf.
Hi, Marius.
Hello.
Let's get started.
Of course.
Good afternoon to all, and welcome, Marius. Thank you for joining us. Marius Dragomir is the founding director of the Media and Journalism Center. He's also a professor at the Central European University in Vienna, where he teaches journalism and research design and classes on advocacy and policy engagement. It's a real pleasure to have you with us for this interview. My name's Laurence. My name is Laurence. I'm the senior advocacy officer at the European Center for Press and Media Freedom. We're talking this afternoon about the practical application of the European Media Freedom Act, or EMFA. In a number of member states, we're seeing governments abusing state economic and regulatory power to gain control over public service media and to manipulate the market. So the central inquiry for the next 15 minutes is what is needed in the EMFA so that it can be an effective tool to fight back against this media capture. Lots to cover in very little time, so let's dive in. Media capture manipulates the audience preferences, right? Part of the issue here is that it can be difficult for the public to understand who profits exactly from the news media they consume, be it politically or financially. The draft of the EMFA introduces some obligations for news media service providers to make information about their ownership accessible. Do you think these go far enough to really enhance media-specific ownership transparency?
Sure. Yes. Well, thank you very much for your question and for inviting me here. From the onset, what I just wanted to emphasize before answering your first question is that I find this law to be really progressive, probably the most progressive legal attempt at EU level in years. Secondly, it's really supported by a group of people in the political establishment at EU level who are really some of them visionaries. However, looking at some of the legal provisions in that, I find it totally impractical. I don't think it will lead to any changes. In fact, especially in environments that are highly captured, which you refer to. Back to your question on media ownership, I think it's great to see legal provisions in the law about media ownership, and I totally agree that it has to promote transparency in this field. On the other hand, I think this has to be really this tool of requiring media suppliers and media outlets to provide ownership information should be adjusted to today's reality, which is a bit different than it was. So, for example, I think a database of owners should be created and should be curated and updated. The most important thing, because I'm coming from the research field, is that the organizations I work for, but others have done that effort in the past, and you can do it, but it's really difficult to update it, especially in real time. So I think a really solid solution to do that, especially by creating an alliance of, for example, academic groups and maybe some people from the regulator should do it to ensure, first of all, its integrity. That's very important to know who's doing it and who's actually monitoring that. I think it should be updated in real time because the developments are so fast that it's very difficult to actually act on media capture if you don't have the data. And secondly, it has to be a highly collaborative effort. I think it has to be in a way decentralized. Nobody should have the power over collecting this data, but at the same time, as I just said, a centralized database should exist. And the second part of the answer is about this issue of ownership. And I'm sure you will address this maybe in other questions, but ownership is not really the issue today, especially if you talk about media capture. If you see the names of some owners in a database, or even some numbers, if you see like 60% ownership concentration, yes, it tells you something. The names might not tell you the whole story. The real story is funding here. And what we have noticed through our research is that in the past few years, and especially when it comes to media capture, the problem today is not concentration of media ownership, but what we call concentration of wealth in the media. This is the real problem, and I think that has to be addressed. I think the link between political parties, governments, and the media when it comes to funding is the real issue.
Thanks for that, Marius, and that ties in really nicely with my second question, which is, of course, that a critical aspect of this media capture phenomena is that state funding for outlets comes with strings attached, right? Nothing's given away for free, so to say. The EMFA does go some way, I believe, in addressing this problem by introducing some standards for fair and transparent allocation of state advertising to media providers. Considering, however, this reality you mentioned of concentration of wealth, combined with the fact that media owners are frequently also active in other businesses, other industries where they rely on state contracts, are these proposed measures sufficient, or what else would be needed to really cut these strings more forcefully, so to say?
Yes, of course. First of all, I have to say that it's really good to see these provisions there. I think provisions on state advertising are really important to in the current European context, because that is a problem in many countries. However, they are not sufficient to just give you a direct answer to your question. I think the major problem here is not necessarily state advertising is part of that, but the bigger problem is the overall financial dependency that is being created between oligarchic structures, the companies that buy a lot of media outlets, and the government. This is the biggest problem, and of course it's important to have provisions on state advertising. I think the better the legal framework to promote transparency in how state advertising is being allocated is really important. However, if with the law that we just see now, with the legal provisions that we just see, I don't expect anything to change. We'll see maybe some nice, local interpretation of the law, but nothing really in reality. The problem is, as I mentioned, this financial link, and the financial link comes from the problem of public procurement, which is usually in many countries, especially in media captured environments, a very corrupt process where money, especially from the EU, is used by governments to feed into the wealth of the oligarchs, and then these structures are buying into media outlets. That is the problem to cut and to solve. And research shows that actually these are the main players, these are the main capturers, if you want to call them that way. So how to do that? I think this is something that law like that should address. In fact, of course, it is not easy, and until you cut this umbilical cord, so to speak, between the government and the media ownership, you will not solve the problem. The way to do it is either extremely. And I'm totally in favor of that, because we have seen that otherwise legal provisions do not work, and extreme measures would be by introducing some provisions that would disqualify or even ban recipients of public procurement funding from buying media outlets, or vice versa. So once you get a lot of funding from the government, you shouldn't be allowed to own a media outlet, because then this link is clearly there. Or you can do it by imposing less extreme measures, for example, by trying to impose some provisions where some financial limits are imposed on media companies that own media outlets. In other words, if you own a number of media outlets, you shouldn't be allowed to receive, over a certain amount of money in public contracts from the government. Of course, this is a legal issue. I think lawyers have to be involved there. But to me, without such provisions, in fact, nothing will happen. Nothing will be solved.
Thanks. That's very clear. My next question is about the assessment of media market concentrations that's foreseen in the draft of the text. The text says that these assessments should take into account three elements: one being the impact on media pluralism, two, safeguards for editorial independence, and three, the economic viability in the absence of concentration. Now, what the text does not specify is the relationship between these elements or their different weight in the assessment of market concentration movements, mergers, and so on. How do you see this balance?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. At the same time, it's very difficult, in fact, I believe, to strike a balance, to strike the right balance between these three aspects, and because they are all important. But in my view, especially thinking about this law as a reaction to the increasing level of capture across many EU countries, I think that the media pluralism and editorial independence should somehow be prioritized in this, in this balance. At the same time, I totally agree that economic viability is important in the whole equation, because it's really important to also take into consideration cases of, let's say, smaller markets where consolidation and concentration of ownership is not necessarily a bad thing. So I don't think there is a blanket solution for all that. But indeed, what you say, I think that there should be a balance between the three. Again, my view coming also, and I know that I'm biased because I'm coming from the independent journalism sector, and we from the research sector looking into that, I think media pluralism and editorial independence should be leading this thinking process.
Thank you. To conclude, let's spend a little bit of time on regulatory authorities. The EMFA introduces a European Board for Media Services to be composed of representatives of national regulatory authorities in the current draft. This composition, of course, raises questions, concerns about how this board would then be insulated from the state capture of those authorities within some member states. How do you think this should be addressed?
Well, I think it's in a way you have the answer in your question. I think the board won't be insulated from the state capture unless you actually remove the people that or representatives or organizations that are captured by the state. So really, if you are looking at the whole legal provision here, it's really looking odd to create a body that incorporates some of the organizations and institutions that in fact suffer and suffer because of the lack of independence and are controlled by the state. So how to deal with that? Of course, some experts and some people might argue that, well, you have a lot of politicization of these bodies in countries, let's say in Central and Eastern Europe, but on the other hand, you have really independent regulators in other parts of the world, and somehow, bringing them together, you strike a balance. I don't really believe in that, political nonsense in a way, especially after so many years of seeing that regulators, especially in countries that in a way are targeted by this law, it continues to be controlled by the state. So I don't think that is the solution. I think what has worked in some countries that have been faced with problems related to capture and control is the bigger involvement of civil society. And of course, that is a very complex process. You will ask the question, what is civil society? Who is the civil society? So you have to think about a way to think about how representative organizations should be defined to be involved in that. But in my view, to really make this body balanced, I think besides this layer of representatives of regulators, what is really important is to maybe have a second layer of NGOs, representatives of the civil society, who would be involved even on a rotating basis in this body. In that way, and of course, you can think about other communities, other experts. Maybe part of this layer should be again people coming from academia, experts, and by bringing them together and rotating them, changing them from time to time, I think you can really achieve more diversity in such a body than just having some people, some of them independent, but many of them not independent in a European body, to just replicate basically what they do on national levels.
Again, that's a very clear recommendation. To finish off, because we're starting to run out of time, how do you see it's a rather big question. How do you see the role of this European board? Should it be a consultative expert group, or would you rather favor a pan-European regulator with more far-reaching powers and more independence from the Commission?
I think it's definitely the latter. I think whatever is built as a consultative recommending body never works, and we've had now plenty of evidence. We have decades of experiences and examples of organizations that are lacking real powers, legally binding powers, haven't achieved almost anything. So really, if you create yet another layer of regulators that act just as a consultative body, you will not solve the problems that, again, I think this law was created as a reaction so in my view, it's really the latter. I think for such a body to be really effective, they must have increasingly, higher powers than what it is now presented in the law to actually see change in some of the countries that have been faced with media capture related problems.
Thanks, Marius. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so I'll try to briefly summarize your points. I hope I do them justice. On ownership transparency, you're calling for a collaborative effort and a decentralized effort that involves academia to truly make this data accessible to the public. You're calling, and you proposed some very concrete measures for cutting the umbilical cord, as you put it, between government and oligarchs who also own media. On the issue of market concentration assessments, I heard you favor prioritizing the elements of pluralism and editorial independence, but not a cookie cutter approach, also especially looking at economic viability in smaller markets and other sort of specific situations where this can take on particular importance. And a board that includes an empowered board that can take real decisions, and that includes civil society, academia on a rotating basis. Does that do it justice?
Perfect. Yes, totally. Perfect.
Great, excellent. Thank you so much for this interesting interview and for participating in the summit.
Thank you very much for your invitation. Thank you. All the best.
You too.
At the last session of the MFRR Summit 2023, we have with us Andreas Ekström, the Speaker of the Year in Sweden, who has been a keynote speaker at events all around the world and served as a digital thought partner for leaders and board of directors. Andreas focuses on digitalization, media, politics, and culture. His branch of journalism is incredibly exciting for its analysis for the sociology of tech rather than tech itself. Author of 9 books, journalist, digital futurist. Andreas, welcome to MFRR Summit.
Thank you very much.
Without spending much time, I would like to ask my first question. For many years, platforms have been stating that they deliver tailored timeline for users, but eventually we have been seeing that this is boosting echo chambers and feeding on digital polarization. At the moment, how do newsreaders receive their news, and what role do algorithms play in our news consumption habits?
Well, I mean, these patterns are well established since a decade or more. And I want to say, if you want to find a landmark event, one thing that changed from an old order where you would get your general view of the world in a daily bundle. You will get the daily paper or the 9 o'clock news. You started to instead get it fragmentized all over the web. And I think the moment when Facebook started to sort its feed from algorithmic indications rather than just chronological indications. So, in the beginning, your Facebook feed was just whoever posted latest was on the top of your feed. They realized this is not content quality. So, and us happily accepting that, they started to try to measure relevance in different ways. The moment when you start to do that, you become an editor. That's the moment when Facebook became the editors of the world. And that's also when we started to go from show to flow. It used to be a news show, but now it's just a continuous flow. This is something that Naomi Klein explored already back in her legendary book, No Logo. So there's several events, but we're at a point where we're in the flow. We're not looking at separate shows.
Is it possible to have some legislative steps or regulation to prevent algorithms and big tech to return to chronology-based timelines instead of the current
situation? I don't think so. No, I also don't think it would be wise. I mean, if we have freedom of running a company, the freedom of expression, the freedom of media, regulation of that is not something I take lightly. So I don't think the solution is to say that, oh, you can't have an algorithmically sorted feed. I want my feeds to be algorithmically sorted. However, I want to understand how it's done. I want to be able to twerk it and adjust it to my liking. And I want to be able to step completely out of it and follow the news just chronologically if I so prefer. So that is something you can regulate, that you have to provide options, or that you're more transparent in how how algorithmic sorting works. But this is not only about news. This is about facts. This is about history. This is about our Google results. I mean, I read Swedish and English at a fluency level, and I understand some French and German, but those are the only 4 languages out of the thousands of languages in the world that I speak. So if I am conducting a Google query and I want to know something about politics in Indonesia, I'm pretty happy that Google knows that I don't speak the local language, that I'm going to need to read something in English or Swedish or maybe even a little bit of French and German to be able to dive into that. Otherwise, there would be 200 hits written in the local language before I could get to something that I could read. Algorithms aren't evil per se. They're not even bad for us per se. It's just that we don't get enough insight. We don't know enough as individuals to be able to make informed decisions on our news feeds.
And concerning the ownership of information, moving on from algorithms, many hybrid models have been proposed over the years concerning the financing of media. I would like to ask, does information come for free, or who owns the information, who controls the information, and what are the risks of relying on ad-sponsored news feeds at the moment?
Well, I understand your question, but it's impossible to answer. We live in a world where there's never been more if you just say information, widely speaking, images, pieces of music, historical facts, books, the amount of information that exists and that we produce is, of course, at a record level. It's just an incredible amount. Everybody's producing every image you're taking. Now, who owns that? There's not one single answer for that, but there is one answer as to how are we getting to this information? And then you get to the burning questions of social media giants, where you really have somewhere between 5 and 10 corporations in the world that almost completely controls our public lives. Is that healthy? No. Are there political ways to go about making that better? Yes. How exactly are we going to do that? I don't know. What I do know is that we need to continuously educate the people not only of Europe, but all over the world, to be able to ask difficult questions. We need politicians who are more on their toes. Both citizens and politicians need to think that, oh, this is something internety, this is something tech. I can just leave that to the tech people. That's a road to disaster. This is not about tech. This is about public life. This is about our society together. It just so happens that plays out digitally now. So whenever somebody says this is a tech issue, they're usually wrong. Tech is just a small tool for building society the decades to come. So I understand your question, but it's impossible to answer it. I mean, who owns information? And nobody and everybody. However, the means of getting to information are controlled by a few, and that's not all positive.
And in recent months, we have seen that platforms started announcing plans for paid membership for premium access to certain services. Mm-hmm. How do you think this will affect our consumption of news on online platforms?
We will get the upside is that somebody who sells a subscription, they don't have to know as much about you. They don't have to gather your data. They don't have to try to upsell you on all kinds of other things and expose you to, based on your data, expose you to ads. That's the upside. The downside is that a lot of people can't afford to pay for a decent news outlet. So you're getting an A-level and B-level citizenship society, even more than we already have. I mean, the difference in the world of knowledge and money and political freedom are already absolutely unacceptable. You don't have to be a lefty, you don't have to be a socialist to think that. It's just a bleeding obvious fact for most decent people that we haven't, in a world where somewhere between 1 and 2 billion people are not certain about where the next meal is going to come from. We have some inequality issues to tackle, and this is just one small part of inequality issues. How do we make sure that citizens all around the world are decently informed to be able to shape their own lives? That's a big issue, but it's connected to the large issue of inequality.
And also concerning the paid subscriptions on social media, recently many people have been stating that after signing up for the paid version, their outreach has increased, or to be more precise, it returned to levels prior to paid membership.
Mm-hmm.
But do you think this will cause an increase in disinformation that is available on social media in the coming period? And where would this take us in terms of accessing information?
Well, right now, that's not the big issue when it comes to, propaganda has always been important in society, a despicable thing, but it's always been important. Promotion has always been important. Political PR, journalism, democracy, it's all based on trying to convince somebody else that your idea is the right idea. Now, this can be done, in different levels of decency. This can be done honestly or dishonestly, but that's not new. The new thing is the scale, the ability for one person to affect a lot of people just through the logic of social media sharing and the distribution of the internet. This is something we've been struggling now, at least some of us who've been interested long enough. For 20 years has this been an issue, 25 years this has been an issue. So that's going to continue to be an issue. But the big thing right now is that we just released artificial intelligence tools for the people for the first time in a just insane amount. I mean, just massive amounts of data is now thrown into not only ChatGPT, but also all kinds of artificial intelligence services. That's the new thing. Well, to be able right now to figure out what's real and what's not, and what's true and what's false, it's going to take a lot of digital literacy on everybody. And we're not there. We're nowhere near that point, unfortunately. So that's the big thing right now. How are we going to do that? This, I do not know.
Intelligence for the people.
And regarding the availability of content, in many countries, media capture is a big problem. And today's theme for the MFRR Summit is media capture. And this is some question that I have received from some of our followers. So it is suggested that nothing really disappears on the internet, but in captured media atmosphere, the sole idea is based on a group of people controlling the availability of information. So how true is that at the age of internet content and at the age of content removal orders and access blocking, targeting news articles and filtered search results, suppressed topics on the timeline? How open is content for journalists on digital platforms, and what is the impact of content moderation on social memory?
Philosophically interesting and difficult question. I mean, who is the editor of the world? Who is the editor of you? This is a question of power, and it's always going to be the interest of political power and the interest of money is always going to get in the way for general humanistic enlightenment. So we're going to have to take a lot of personal responsibility for this. I am a strong believer and an advocate for having a couple of strong public service media institutions in each country. I'm lucky to live in Sweden, where Swedish television, SVT, and Swedish National Broadcasting Radio, SR, have a long history of doing decent, broad work, not only in news, but in general education and enlightenment for the people. This costs us some money, paid through the tax bill every year. Most Swedes are happy with the system, always, happy to criticize it too. But we are lucky to live in a political environment where it's okay to be critical about something that we own together. Some would call it government media. I could call it publicly owned or collectively owned media too. I think that is something good. I think that generally the idea of the town providing a library for the citizens is a good idea with where you don't pay anything. That some towns in a nation provide a subsidized opera house or subsidized theater, because some things in life aren't necessarily profitable, but there are some things that make us human. There are some things that push us forward to try to be better and evolve as a species. And I think that we need to sometimes be sure that we're guarding values that are not measured in money. Media is no exception.
Thank you so much, Andreas. I would like to ask one final question. This is something that we have discussed on the first day in Safety of Journalists Day as well. concerning surveillance of journalists. When it comes to using messaging applications, many journalists rely on available tools, but surveillance and hacking seems to be an increasing trend, threatening many journalists. Is it possible to have absolute digital security when one is involved in journalism, or what steps should one follow to sustain it? Is it easy for journalists to pick a secure application today?
Well, there are some good alternatives, and I think that all traditional serious media outlets are thinking long and hard about this, and most of them have methods like this is what we would advise a whistleblower on how to go about getting in touch with reporters and letting reporters know what's going on. My general advice to citizens, to whistleblowers, to media outlets is to just make sure to never put all of your eggs in one basket. Make sure that you have a number of channels available for yourself and for others to contact you, where you store information that just makes you less vulnerable. Information going out, information going in, information you want to spread, information you want to keep close to yourself. Several places to store that, several communication channels. That's probably the best advice.
Thank you so much for this advice, Andreas. This will be the concluding remarks for the MFRR Summit 2023, Press Freedom on the Line. And I would like to also take this opportunity to thank all our viewers that have joined us in the last 3 days. And I would especially like to thank our communications team, Jordan and Olga, for making all this possible. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you in about an hour at the IJ4EU Impact Award ceremony.